Hello there. Today I'm going to be talking about the resurrection argument and why I think it is not very good. So let's begin with an introduction. The resurrection argument is an argument that apologists have made for many decades now, and it relates to the idea that the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus and subsequent appearances to his disciples is sufficiently convincing that we should believe that Jesus was indeed the Son of God and that this miracle provides a vindication of his divine status and so forth. On the screen here, you can see a number of books that have made a case, using different lines of evidence for this core argument. And what I'm going to be doing today is responding to a sort of generalized form of this argument, not any author in particular, though I'll quote from various apologists over the course of the discussion. So at the outset, let me explain the background assumptions that I'm going to make henceforth in presenting my response to the resurrection argument. And it's important to note that obviously how we assess an argument is quite dependent on our background assumptions. So what I'm going to do in this video is adopt quite a strong set of background assumptions in order to focus the debate and provide a bit of a novel response to the resurrection argument. And so you'll see what I mean in a moment. So first, I'm going to assume that God exists. Second, I'm going to assume not just that God exists, but that God has some reason to send a miraculous special messenger to humanity to communicate his purposes to us. Then, moving to the case of Jesus specifically, I'm going to assume that Jesus lived and was a moral teacher and a prophet and so forth, that he was executed and buried as specified in the Gospels, that his tomb also was found empty as specified in the Gospels, that the Gospel accounts of his post-mortem appearances actually do contain eyewitness testimony. So I'm not going to necessarily assume who wrote the Gospels, but regardless of that, I'm going to assume that the material that they contain does derive from eyewitness testimony. And finally, I'm going to assume that Jesus' followers began preaching about the resurrection and the core claims that are contained in the Gospels very soon after the death of Jesus, on the order of weeks to months, let's say a month or two. Now, many of these are very strong assumptions, and I certainly don't actually believe all of them. Obviously, I'm an atheist and a naturalist, and so I don't believe one or two, and some of the others I find pretty dubious as well. Like, I'm not sure if the Gospels really do contain much, if any, direct eyewitness testimony, like coming directly from an eyewitness. I think the tomb probably was empty, but I'm not sure about that, and I don't know exactly how long it took until Jesus' followers began to preach the resurrection. It might have been longer than just a few weeks. I'm certainly do believe that Jesus lived and was known as a teacher and a prophet and that he was executed. So some of these I really do believe, some of them I don't. But for the purposes of this video, I'm going to assume all of them. And in particular, I want to emphasize 5, 6, and 7 as being the relevant assumptions, background assumptions, that effectively I'm going to take as facts that require an explanation. So I'm not trying to explain why God exists or something like that. I'm taking that as background, likewise that Jesus lived and was executed. What I'm going to seek to explain and contrast a resurrection explanation versus a naturalistic explanation is that Jesus' tomb was found empty, that the Gospels contain eyewitness testimony of Jesus appearing to his disciples after his death, and then that those same followers of Jesus then began preaching that Jesus had been resurrected, within a matter of weeks. So those are the key facts: empty tomb appearances and belief in the resurrection that I'm going to attempt to explain. And the previous 4 assumptions are background assumptions that I'm going to make and assume in the course of my explanation. Now, you might wonder, and many skeptics ask me, why would I grant so many of these assumptions, including dubious things like, well, God existing, but also God wanting to send a special messenger to humankind, the tomb being empty, the Gospels being informed directly by eyewitness testimony. Why grant all of these things? Well, I think that there's a good reason to do this. Firstly, almost all apologetics, if you look back at the books that I cited previously, this is applicable to that. Almost all apologetics focuses on establishing these points here. Specifically points a little bit 3 through 4, those are often taken as background as well, but specifically 5, 6, and 7, and then maybe somewhat point 2 as well. The vast majority of apologetics spends pages and pages and hundreds of pages trying to establish these points. So what I'm going to do is try to bypass the vast majority of apologetics by just granting all of these points, just assuming that they are indeed correct. As I've said, these points can all be contested and have been contested before by many others, but what I'm going to argue in this video is that we don't need to do that as skeptics, or naturalists, atheists, however you think of yourselves. even if we grant almost everything that the apologists argue for, the resurrection is still a terrible explanation of the key facts, or so I will argue. So even if we grant that God exists, that he has a reason or a desire to send a special messenger to humanity, even if we grant that Jesus lived and taught and was executed and buried, even if we grant the tomb was empty, even if we grant that Jesus's disciples did have some sort of experience of him appearing to them, and that the Gospels contain eyewitness testimony of those appearances, like of what they remembered of those appearances. And even if Jesus' followers then did begin to preach the resurrection very soon after Jesus' death, a matter of, say, weeks or maybe a couple of months, even if we grant all of these things, the apologetic argument that Jesus probably was resurrected and was the Messiah and all those sorts of things is still highly problematic. It's still a bad explanation. And you might call this the enough rope approach to counter-apologetics. So, what I'm going to be doing in this video is taking a contrastive explanation approach. I'm going to be contrasting the resurrection explanation that Christians typically give with my preferred naturalistic explanation, the RHBS model, which I've defended before, though here I'll add some additional elements to it. And so in order to provide some background for that, first I'm going to talk a little bit about what explanations are and what their purpose is and how to assess them. So an explanation should tell us why and how a given set of facts or observations occurred. It should sort of rationalize, justify a particular set of phenomenon. In the words of Charles Peirce, if we take an explanation, the facts to be explained should follow as a matter of course. And I think this is a good way of putting it. It doesn't mean that they should follow with certainty or deductively. It just means that they should follow plausibly, as a matter of course, given our background assumptions. They should make sense. We should be able to understand why they happened or why they are true. We can assess explanations in terms of three main criteria. So the first is explanatory scope. So this refers to the range of things, the number of facts, the scope of the explanation, what it can account for, how much it can explain. The more it can explain, the more it can account for, the better, other things being equal. The second point is explanatory power. So this refers to how likely or how plausible are the facts rendered by the explanation. Some explanations render the facts somewhat more plausible, some render them very plausible, some render them exceedingly plausible. So it depends on the explanatory power of the explanation. So again, other things being equal, greater explanatory power is to be preferred. The final criterion is plausibility. So this relates to how likely the postulates made by an explanation are given accepted background knowledge. Every explanation must make at least one postulate, otherwise it's not an explanation, it's just a redescription of the facts, or it could be irrelevant, but if it is relevant, it's going to have to go beyond the facts, because the point of an explanation is to explain the how and the why of the facts, not just to restate them, which means that any explanation needs to postulate something that's not directly observed, something that goes beyond the fact, some process, some phenomenon, some other fact that we don't directly know. That's the postulate or postulates that you make, which constitute the explanation. Now, we can assess those postulates based on their plausibility. How likely are those postulates in themselves, given whatever accepted set of background knowledge that we're going to take as given? That's why I emphasized at the start of the video what set of facts I'm taking as background knowledge. It's not limited to that. We'll pull in results from history and science as well as we go forth. But I am assuming those set of 1 to 7 as background knowledge, or specifically 1 to 4 as the background knowledge, and then 5 through 7 are the facts to be explained. I'll just pull those up again for your reference here. So I'm taking 1 through 4 as background knowledge, and then 5, 6, and 7 are the facts to be explained. Specifically, the empty tomb, the appearances, and the disciples' belief in the resurrection. And so what we're going to do is we're going to then look at two main explanations for these facts, given the background knowledge that I stated, and we're going to contrast these explanations in terms of explanatory scope, power, and plausibility. Primarily, we're going to look at plausibility, but we will see what I mean by that in a moment. All right, so that's some background. Just to recap, I'm making a lot of strong assumptions as background in order to try to focus on things that I think are most important and illustrate the weakness of the apologetic regarding the resurrection. So I'm assuming the existence of God, I'm assuming general reliability of the reports in the Gospels, and so forth. I'm trying to explain the empty tomb, the appearances to Jesus, and the belief in the resurrection. And we're going to contrast two hypotheses that attempt to account for those facts. First, the resurrection hypothesis, and then we'll look at my preferred naturalistic hypothesis, and I'll explain why it's much better. So first, we're going to look at the resurrection hypothesis. And this is very important because this is a step that apologists very often skip completely. They don't actually say much, if anything, about what the resurrection hypothesis is or why we should believe it. They just sort of take it as granted that everyone agrees that the resurrection, if at least as a postulate, it would explain the relevant data. But I don't think it does a very good job at all. So let me explain why. First, what is the resurrection hypothesis? So first, Jesus was the Jewish Messiah. This is kind of crucial to the whole idea that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah as specified in the Old Testament or the Jewish Bible. Next, God raised Jesus from the dead as a culmination of Jesus' salvific mission. Just as a parenthetic note that, because of the idea of the Trinity, you could argue that Jesus and God are the same, so Jesus raised himself from the dead. I'm not going to worry too much about that, but for any pedants there, you can rephrase that if you prefer. I'm just going to say God raised Jesus from the dead, and the purpose of this was not just sort of random or arbitrary. It was as a culmination of Jesus' salvific mission, his triumph over death for our sins, right? The risen Jesus, after exiting the tomb, then appeared to his followers, the disciples, as a vindication on proof of his divine status. It's important here that that is the purpose of the appearances, because if you don't state what the purpose is, then it's entirely unclear why Jesus would appear to his disciples or really anyone at all. Why would he just not go off to heaven? The stated reason is usually that it was a vindication and proof of his status as a Messiah and as the Son of God, and a proof of his salvific purpose. So that's what the explanation is supposed to be. There's a theological content to it. It's not just a miracle in isolation. The miracle has theological content and relevance in terms of culmination of salvific mission. That's the raising from the dead part. The appearances part is the vindication and proof of that and Jesus' status. And based on their experiences of Jesus appearing to them, the disciples then believed that he was the Son of God and that he'd risen from the dead, and they began to preach the resurrection, at least within a few weeks to a couple of months afterwards. So that's the substance of the resurrection hypothesis, or how it explains the facts. It explains the facts through a miracle of God raising Jesus from the dead that accounts for the empty tomb. Jesus then appeared to his followers through miraculous appearances. He's risen from the dead, so he can then appear to his followers as vindication, proof of his status. And then based on the special experiences of the risen Jesus that they'd had, plus, I guess, seeing the empty tomb as well, the disciples came to believe in the resurrection and they began to preach it. All right, so now I'm going to explain why this is not a very good explanation. So first, we're going to talk about the first idea that Jesus was a special divine messenger. So here I'm going to talk in general terms about the idea that God would want to send a divine messenger, a special messenger to mankind to reveal his purposes. So at this point, we're not looking at Jesus being the Jewish Messiah. We're just looking more broadly about, suppose that we thought that God would want to send a messenger to mankind, a special messenger. He may send others, right? I'm not assuming it's only one. But if God wants to send a messenger to humans, what sort of person would we expect? What things would we be looking for? And how probable is it that Jesus would be this person? So remember, one of the background assumptions is that God exists and would want to send such a person. So I'm assuming that God has that purpose. We're now asking, how probable is it that Jesus was this special messenger? And obviously, we can't assume at the outset that, Jesus was the Jewish Messiah or Jesus was the Son of God, because that would be assuming the thing that we're trying to prove, right? We're only assuming that God exists and wanted to send some sort of special messenger. How probable is it that it was Jesus? And my claim is that it's not very probable at all. So let's have a look at some considerations. First of all, Jesus was born about 3,000 years into recorded history, give or take, depending on how you date things, but about 3,000 years. And importantly, he wasn't globally well known until very recently, last couple of centuries. So say about 5,000 years into recorded history. You could even argue there's prehistory before that, but at least 5,000 years into civilizational history, right? That's a very long time to wait. Why is it exactly that God's waiting 5,000 years? Well, 3,000 years to send Jesus, and then another couple of thousand years before it sort of becomes generally known who Jesus is, and the vast majority of mankind actually has access to this information. This does not seem like what you would expect if we think that God created humans for special purposes and wants to send a special messenger to explain his purposes to us, to perform salvific purposes, and then to essentially form the basis of a relationship between humans and specific humans and himself, which is what Christians claim. Why is he waiting 3,000 years to do this? Why doesn't this happen in ancient Egypt or Sumeria and then can be propagated throughout history? And why is it that so few people know about it until very recently? Yes, today, Christianity is a globally known religion. It's the largest religion, and even in places that aren't Christian, most people know at least something about Jesus. But that wasn't true until a couple of hundred years ago. The vast majority of human history, the vast majority of humans knew absolutely nothing about Jesus. So this just doesn't seem like what you would expect at all if this is God's purpose. He seems to be doing it in a very bad, inefficient way. I think that this is not definitive because you can always come up with some excuse as to, well, God has mysterious purposes and you don't know. But based on what is postulated, God wants to have a special messenger to reveal his purposes to mankind. This just doesn't seem like what you would expect to see. You would expect a much older figure who then becomes well known throughout history very quickly and consistently, so people can make a choice and informed decision about whether to relate to him and understand his purposes. If Jesus' revelations are important, then why don't more people have the opportunity throughout history to be made aware of them? I think this is a very relevant issue. Now, separate to that, let's also consider the fact that there are many other potential candidates for a special divine messenger from God. It's a little unclear what the criteria might be, but at least you could plausibly say that someone who is a special divine messenger from God must at least be known to be a special kind of religious or moral teacher and make claims of themselves. Maybe we don't know exactly what sort of claim because we can't presuppose a specific theology yet. That's not part of our assumptions we're making. We're just assuming God exists and wants to send a special messenger. So we're going to assume that there'll be some sort of moral teacher, prophet or something like that, and they'll make some sort of claim about their status, but we don't necessarily know exactly what claim. But even with that assumption, there's at least 300 people listed on the English Wikipedia from a quick check that I did who claimed to be a deity or the Messiah or an avatar of God or Buddha or something like that, right? Different languages in different religious contexts, but there's at least 300 people, named people, who claimed that. And those are people who achieved some relative amount of popularity such that they're listed on the English Wikipedia and still known about today. Certainly, there are at least thousands more lost to history or at least unknown in the West. Now, in addition to that, the special messenger could be thousands of years into the future. They may not have come yet. We can't assume that they would have necessarily come already. After all, Jesus was born 3,000 years into history and wasn't widely known until 5,000 years into history. So if it can be 3,000 to 5,000, why not 5,000 to 7,000 or 10,000 years into recorded history? It seems to be just an assumption that people make that, well, we have to look into history to find the candidate of this, special messenger of God. Again, we're assuming that there will be one, but we don't know that they've come yet. So they could be into the future, even thousands of years into the future. So there's yet more candidates potentially available. So I assess this, and I know this is subjective, but this prior probability that Jesus was the special one of all of these to be no more than 1 in 10,000, just because of all of the thousands of such people who've claimed this special status throughout history and who will continue to do so in the future, presumably. Now, you could quibble with that, of course, but the point that I'm making here is not the exact number. It's just that I think unless you're going to assume a bunch of more specific assumptions about the nature of this special divine messenger, I don't think you can say that there's a high probability that it's going to be Jesus, because there's just lots of other candidates. Now, maybe you can condition on additional evidence, but we need to know what that evidence is going to be and why we should take that as evidence for Jesus rather than against Jesus. So the prior probability, I think, is fairly low. Now, this is prior to looking at the resurrection evidence. We're just considering the claims people made about themselves and the fact that they were moral teachers and so forth. However, there's another consideration that I want to levy against Jesus, and potentially this would also count against other past teachers as well, by the way, but here we're focusing on Jesus. And that is that if Jesus really was the special messenger of God to reveal his purposes and nature and so forth to humanity, there are many moral teachings that are absent from Jesus's recorded teachings. These include explicit condemnation of slavery as a political institution, explicit condemnation of gender subordination and inequality. And I want to emphasize here, I'm not talking about theological equality of men and women before God, because of course that Jesus does talk about this. I'm talking about social and political equality of the genders in the here and now, which is not at all clearly taught by Jesus or Paul in the New Testament. Tolerance between people of different ethnic groups. I mean, Jesus is usually fairly tolerant, but there are some problematic passages like the way that he treats the woman at the well, like Samaritan peoples, the parable of the Good Samaritan. We don't find any explicit condemnation of racism or whatever the equivalent concept would be at that time, or the idea that all ethnic groups and peoples should be equal under the law or things like that. We don't see any statements about the importance of representation in government, any sort of principles of democracy, or any idea that the government should be accountable to the people or represent the people in any way. We don't find any statements of universal human rights. Once again, I'm not talking about the idea that all humans have a theological standing before God. That is taught. I'm talking about social and political rights, the idea that everyone should be equal before the law, which we don't find Jesus teaching. And I think we also don't find very clear teachings in the behavior of animal welfare. We find some rather bizarre passages like when Jesus casts the spirits into the pigs and they run off the cliff. Like, that doesn't seem very considerate for animal welfare, and it's just a kind of strange. Or when he curses the fig tree that shrivels up and dies. I know that's not an animal, but it's sort of a bit hard to interpret Jesus' relationship to the natural world there, if you see what I mean. So, we can discuss particular passages, but I would argue, as many have before, that if Jesus was a special divine messenger, we would expect much better teachings and many more teachings covering issues than we actually find. There are many good things that Jesus does teach. I'm not saying he was overall bad or anything like that, but I'm saying that I find it very underwhelming from the point of view of what we would expect from the foundation of morality and creator of the universe, which is supposedly the source of Jesus' teachings. And although it's certainly true that people have read in and seen implications of all of these points in Jesus' teachings, I think that the explicit, unambiguous, clearly demarcated announcement of all of these issues and others is just not there in Jesus' teachings. And I think that it should be, if someone was to be it's what we would expect from a genuine divine messenger. We would expect all of these moral teachings to be present, and others that are even things that we are not familiar with or that we haven't even thought about. We would expect genuine moral insight and progress. And the vast majority of what Jesus teaches is concern for the poor and the downtrodden and variants of the golden rule, which is admirable, but it's not really that novel. And there's many, as I said, as I've outlined here, many absent moral teachings that I would have expected. So, to summarize, on the basis of when Jesus was born and the many other candidates for a special divine messenger, as well as the absent moral teachings, I find it relatively implausible that Jesus was a special divine messenger from God. This is a statement of prior plausibility, so there could be evidence that overcomes this, but I think at the outset, the evidence is not looking good. The considerations are not looking good, just looking at Jesus and his teachings and when he was born and so forth. A final point that I'll make here is that I think Christians will generally not find this argument very convincing, this slide here. But one of the reasons for this is because Christians naturally, I think, and sort of intuitively judge prophets or Messiah claimers or other teachers using Jesus as the archetype. So they compare everything to Jesus and then assess, well, how close was he to Jesus, or how much does he live up to Jesus' standard? So they'll always say Jesus was the best candidate because they compare everything to Jesus. Now, what I want to ask is for people to step back from that, because obviously that's assuming what we need to establish. What we should be doing is thinking about, from the basic suppositions that we're beginning with, what sort of messenger would we assume God would send? I claim that you would think that he would send one early in recorded history who would become widely known very soon after that, so that people could relate to him and understand his teachings across a wider range of peoples as possible around the world over history. And I think that we would see Jesus' moral teachings clearly stand out from the time and place and hold up over thousands of years without major absences. But there are major absences, and what he did teach I don't think is actually that novel when you consider that the Golden Rule has been taught in effectively all societies throughout history. It's not really that novel. So overall, I just don't think that Jesus is a very good candidate, despite what many Christians may think in holding Jesus up as the archetype. I think you need to step back from that and consider, from a prior standpoint, is there really a good reason to think that Jesus stands out? I don't think there is. But let's now move on to talk about the more specific claim, not just that Jesus was a special messenger of God, but that he actually was the Jewish Messiah. Now, the Messiah was understood, based on the prophetic writings in the Hebrew Bible, as a savior of the Jewish people and special envoy of God, well, to the Jewish people and also to the world. One problem with the hypothesis that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah is that it's not possible for Jesus to be a literal paternal descendant of King David, as was required in the Jewish scriptures, as stated, for example, in Isaiah and Jeremiah. The descent from King David's line was always understood paternally. It was a patrilineal descent. The scriptures make very clear that King David's line was to be restored when, through the Messiah was to be a king of the Jewish people, and he was to be from the line of David. But at least according to what Christians teach, Jesus could not have been of the line of David because he didn't have an earthly father. Adoption is just not sufficient here. The Hebrew scriptures are very clear. The Messiah needs to be a literal patrilineal descendant of the line of King David, which would be restored through the Messiah. Jesus cannot do that, and Jews, I should say, have been saying this for 2,000 years. It's if Christians are correct in what they say about Jesus being having a virgin birth, he cannot be the Jewish Messiah. It just doesn't work. Adoption is not sufficient. It needs to be a literal paternal descendant from the line of David. Now, next point. Jesus also does not fulfill many of the specific predictions of what the Messiah would do or bring about. I know that the common response to this is, well, that'll happen at the second coming. I'll comment on that in a moment. But first of all, the Messiah was to gather all of the Jews back to the land of Israel. He was to usher in an era of world peace, spread universal knowledge of the God of Israel throughout all nations, and there's also references to rebuilding the temple as well, although the temple did exist at the time of Jesus, so how applicable that one is slightly less clear. But at the very least, the Messiah is supposed to do these three things. And very clearly, Jesus did not do these things. So the Jews were not gathered back to Israel at the time of Jesus. In fact, only a few decades later, they were scattered even more. They'd already been somewhat scattered around the Mediterranean, and following the uprising in AD 70, many were expelled from Israel and further scattered. So that didn't happen. Ushering in an era of world peace. Well, obviously that didn't happen. And spread universal knowledge of the God of Israel. Well, that didn't really happen either. There was teaching about Jesus, which spread around the world in the centuries following the death of Jesus in the form of Christianity, though, not Judaism. It's sort of unclear whether that would count. I guess that depends on your theological perspective. But more to the point, it wasn't universal. It was localized mostly to parts of the Middle East and Europe. It's still not universal to this day, although it's more universal than it was. So Jesus just does not seem to fit the criteria that the Messiah needs to fulfill. And again, Jews have been saying this for 2,000 years. He just doesn't tick the boxes. Now, as I mentioned before, the typical response to this is, well, Jesus, when he came the first time, inaugurated God's kingdom. He began the process of spreading knowledge of God and of gathering the Jews to the land of Israel. But, these things take time. And so they will only reach fulfillment and culmination when Jesus returns in the second coming, which, will happen at some point, I suppose. It's been 2,000 years now, but who knows? It could be soon, it could be another 1,000 years, but eventually it will happen, right? Now, this is a classic example of what's called spiritualization. This is a response that's been known in the literature as a response to cognitive dissonance. When a prediction is made, it's not fulfilled. Religious and other movements tend to spiritualize the prediction. So they turn it from a literal physical prophecy into something that's spiritual. So Jesus did inaugurate the kingdom of God and knowledge of Israel, but he did so in a sort of spiritual way that only begins the process on earth and doesn't actually fulfill that literally, physically right now. That'll happen sort of at some later date. So I think that this is a very bad justification for what clearly are failed predictions or failed prophecies. And I don't find it very convincing. And Jews don't find it very convincing in the vast majority of cases. And this idea that there'll be a second coming of the Messiah is not to be found in the Jewish Old Testament either, and is a clear retroactive response, in my view, to the fact that Jesus clearly did fail to fulfill all the criteria of the Jewish Messiah. So I don't find those responses convincing. You'll only people who are already Christians or sympathetic to Christianity, I think, find those convincing. Everyone else doesn't find them convincing, finds them to be post hoc rationalization. So I think that we should conclude that Jesus just did not fulfill the criteria of the Jewish Messiah. A final point here is that worship of Jesus, now this is slightly distinct from whether Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, but worship of Jesus as God or the Son of God is clearly contrary to Jewish rejection of idolatry and affirmation of the oneness of God. Of course, Christians don't think that it is, but Jews historically have overwhelmingly thought that is, and that you can't worship Jesus, you can worship God alone, and God doesn't have these multiple, three persons within one being, or however it's supposed to work, that's not what God is, and you shouldn't be worshiping Jesus because that's idolatry. Now, I think even more convincing than any of these points is the idea that there is no connection in the Jewish scriptures between the Messiah and resurrection and forgiveness of sins. These ideas were only brought together by early Christians. So N.T. Wright has written extensively about this. He talks about in terms of mutations of the idea of resurrection and of the Messiah. So let me read a quote from William Lane Craig here, who talks about this. Quote, Jews had no conception whatsoever of a Messiah who, instead of triumphing over Israel's enemies, would be shamefully executed by them as a criminal. The Messiah was supposed to be a triumphant figure who would command the respect of Jew and Gentile alike and who would establish the throne of David in Jerusalem. Yet Jesus' disciples held deeply a conviction that he, Jesus, was the promised Messiah, a Messiah who failed to deliver and to reign, was defeated, humiliated, and slain by his enemies, was a contradiction in terms. Nowhere do ancient Jewish texts speak of this sort of Messiah, end quote. Now, I agree. Craig is exactly correct here. Ancient Jewish sources don't talk about a Messiah who is killed and humiliated, and or who resurrects prior to the resurrection of everyone else. That's just not how they understood the Messiah, and it wasn't connected to this idea of resurrection at all. Now, Craig presents this as a reason why we should think that the resurrection actually did happen, because according to Craig, N.T. Wright, and others, the only way that you can account for the changing views about the Messiah and resurrection that we see with the early Christian movement, how that they modified their views about the nature of these things and how they work, was through a very powerful experience, which they argue must have been seeing the risen Jesus. Now, I'll argue about that the nature of that experience later, but the point that I want to make here is that regardless of what it would have taken to have changed the disciples' minds, the fact remains that the Jewish texts do not speak of a Messiah who resembles Jesus at all. What Craig, N.T. Wright, and others don't seem to understand is that this is very strong evidence against the claim that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah. You can't simultaneously say that Jews didn't think of the Messiah this way, and then also say, but this is evidence that he really was the Messiah. No, that's evidence that Jesus wasn't the Messiah because he doesn't fit the bill. That's not how the Messiah was thought of, described, or supposed to be. So how can you then say, but somehow this is evidence Jesus is the Messiah? No, it's Jesus. It's evidence that he wasn't the Messiah. He was, in fact, a very naughty boy, or perhaps that's closer to the truth. Now, let's move on to the third point that I think is evidence against Jesus being the special messenger of God and the Jewish Messiah and being raised from the dead by God. The nature of the post-mortem appearances. So one thing we know from the Gospels is that Jesus only appeared to his followers in and around Jerusalem, and maybe extending to Galilee, depending on which Gospel you read, for a few weeks following his resurrection. He didn't appear to anyone else. Like, there's the reported appearance of the 500. It's sort of unclear who those people were. I presume they were mostly his followers. Also, that's not in the Gospels, so we don't have much information about it. Paul just sort of mentions it offhand. But basically, it seems Jesus appeared to his followers. Now, I argue that this is not what you'd expect for a divine figure who's trying to vindicate, or whose purpose in appearing is to vindicate his status to all of humanity. Why is he only appearing to people who already knew him? In particular, we don't have any appearances to all of Jerusalem, or to the Roman Senate, or the Chinese imperial court, or the ancient Americans, as Mormons believe. And Jesus could have very easily made appearances to all of these people and more besides, and that would have served as very, very convincing vindication of his status. It would blow apart, if we had historical records of these things, it would completely blow apart my proposed explanation, because the psychological and sociological processes that I appeal to in accounting for the appearances and the belief of the disciples couldn't possibly account for appearances of Jesus to the Mesoamericans and to the Chinese and to the Roman Senate. So this would be far stronger evidence than we actually do have of the divine status of Jesus and vindication of his purpose in being sent to humanity. So that is, I think, by far what we would expect Jesus to do if that was his purpose in making appearances. Yet we don't find this. We actually see that Jesus only appears to people who already knew him and already had a reason, as I'll argue later, to see him again and come to an understanding of why he was killed. I think this is very strong evidence against Jesus being a special messenger and against appearing for this reason. Of course, maybe he had other reasons to appear, but again, you can postulate any ad hoc psychological, like divine psychology you like. The fact of the matter is that the postulated reason that I've always heard, and that Christians typically give, is that he appeared to his disciples primarily to vindicate his status and establish his triumph over death, and also give them the mission of continuing to preach. So he could have certainly done that by appearing to them, but he could have done it by appearing to other people as well, which is what the Book of Mormon, the Mormons believe, is that Jesus appeared to people in the Americas and also preached there and got them to start sharing the gospel. So Jesus could have done that. He could have done that better if they had the gospels being spread in China and in Mesoamerica, and say India as well, rather than just in Jerusalem. And also it would have served for that and much future generations as very convincing evidence that Jesus really had triumphed over death, because there's really no other way you could account for these appearances in such different cultural contexts. So the appearances that we see just aren't what you'd expect if Jesus really was raised from the dead and appeared to vindicate that status. So I conclude on the basis of the implausibility of Jesus being a special messenger on the outset, the implausibility of Jesus being the Jewish Messiah, and the implausible nature of his appearances, that the resurrection hypothesis has really not got very much going for it in terms of accounting for the key facts of empty tomb, resurrection appearances, and belief in the resurrection. So now we're going to turn to a contrary or a contrasting hypothesis, a naturalistic hypothesis, to explain the facts as we mentioned. I should just emphasize that although I did assume in the first two premises that God does exist, of course that doesn't imply that we need to appeal to God or a miracle in order to account for any particular facts. So I'm not going to appeal to God existing in accounting for the facts in the course of my hypothesis is going to be entirely naturalistic. But importantly, what I'm not going to appeal to is the idea that miracles can't happen or that God wouldn't send a messenger or something like that. So that's why I make those assumptions at the outset. I'm just going to say that we can account for the key facts of relevance here without appealing to any of those assumptions. We don't need to make an assumption either way, really, about whether God exists or not. I'm just going to assume that for the sake of argument that I can assume that, and it doesn't cost me anything. The argument still goes ahead. So hitherto, we're only going to appeal to naturalistic aspects and see what we can explain on that basis. And the naturalistic hypothesis that I prefer and will defend here is called the RHBS model, and that's an acronym, or actually an initialism, which relates to the key components of the model. So what I'm going to do is briefly outline the model here, and then we're going to go through and step through the details, and I'll provide evidence for the key claims that I make. So first of all, the R stands for removal. Jesus' body, according to the explanation, was removed from the tomb before Sunday morning. So that's when the empty tomb was discovered by women followers. So I give two possible reasons for why his body was removed. The first was by Joseph of Arimathea, deliberately as a reburial, and alternatively, it was stolen by tomb robbers. So we'll go through both of those in a moment. But the hypothesis is that the body was removed by robbers or by Joseph himself, and that's why it was empty. So that accounts for the empty tomb. The next set of hypotheses or postulates relate to explaining the appearances. So following the discovery of the empty tomb by various women followers, Mary and then subsequently Peter had an experience, an individual experience of the risen Jesus appearing to them, and that was took the form of a hallucination. So they had a hallucinatory experience of Jesus appearing to them, speaking and or visually present before them. I think that was likely a bereavement hallucination, which we'll talk about in a moment. So that accounts for the first individual hallucinations, and subsequent to that, I think that there were collective religious experiences of the risen Jesus which occurred in group settings. So these were precipitated by the discovery of the empty tomb and the individual hallucinations. The early disciples, or groups of the disciples, had collective religious experiences of the risen Jesus. And I think that those can be accounted for and understood in terms of psychological and sociological processes, which I'll outline in a moment. The fourth component is cognitive biases. Or that's what the B stands for. So after these initial experiences, the disciples discussed them with each other. As a result, their memories were reshaped through processes like reconstructive recall, social memory contagion, and then irrational belief persistence and cognitive dissonance to form these experiences that you had, which were probably quite disjointed and they didn't understand very well, into a more coherent narrative, which was more consistent and fit within a theological framework. And finally, the last component, socialization. So any disagreement that there may have persisted about exactly what had happened or doubt that things had gone as some of them said was muted by social pressure for conformity. So beliefs were formed and sustained within a very close-knit, religiously motivated context, which was not conducive to skepticism and investigation, but was conducive to conformity and maintaining the preferred belief system, and particularly a belief system that vindicated their faith in Jesus. So we'll talk about those aspects as well. So these are the key elements of the RHBS model. Now, I argue that these components can help adequately account for and explain the key facts that we're trying to account for. Remember, empty tomb, appearances, and belief in the resurrection. And that they're all quite plausible. I need to make postulates about how specific things happened to specific people, but the mechanisms that I'm appealing to are all known and established in existing literature. So let's go through and talk about the details of how this is supposed to work. So let's begin with the empty tomb. So first of all, let's begin by talking about reburial, the idea that Jesus' body was removed by Joseph of Arimathea deliberately and reburied at another site. Now, Jewish law required that a body be removed from the cross before the beginning of the Sabbath. And we know that Jesus was crucified on preparation day, the day before the Sabbath. In John 19, for example, it says, "Therefore, because of the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there." There's an indication here that there was a need to bury Jesus fairly quickly. And this is also mentioned in Mark. So Mark, for example, in Mark, Joseph asked for Jesus' body when evening had already come. So that's Friday evening. Because it was a preparation day, that is the day before the Sabbath. So just before the Sabbath began, like as evening is beginning, I believe Sabbath begins at sunset, so evening would be, the beginning of evening would be just before the Sabbath is about to begin. Joseph asked for the body to be taken down to be consistent with Jewish law and placed somewhere. So the hypothesis is that the reason why Joseph reburied the body is because it was only ever intended to be a temporary burial. Temporary because there was a need to place Jesus' body somewhere to conform to Jewish law, that the body shouldn't still be up during the Sabbath. Now, why Joseph specifically did this is, I postulate, because the Romans feared civil disorder. We know this from historical records that particularly at that time, there was a lot of uprisings and protests and violence and controversies between the Jewish authorities and the Jewish people and the Romans. The Romans were not very respectful all the time of the Jewish religious practices, and there were constant uprisings and revolts and disputes about this. And we know from the Gospels, I've got some references in Matthew and Luke there, that Jesus' trial and execution were messy, loud public affairs. The Romans were very concerned about a revolt. That's very clear if you look at passages about Pilate. He was, talks about him deciding for fear of the Jews. He was really worried about disorder or revolt, which would look really bad back in Rome and potentially cost him his job. So he and other Roman authorities were primarily concerned about not allowing this to spiral out of control, keeping things calm, keeping things quiet, keeping things private. So they wanted to ensure that Jewish law was respected, because if it wasn't, that would lead to problems for them. And they wanted to ensure that it was done in a private, quiet way. So for them, in order to meet these criteria, I postulate that Jesus was placed temporarily in a private nearby tomb and reburied as soon as possible thereafter. As soon as possible would be on Saturday evening. So that's when I postulate Jesus' body was removed from Joseph's tomb and then reburied somewhere else in a mass grave somewhere, presumably. Now, whether Joseph volunteered for this because he was concerned about proprieties being met, or maybe he was slightly sympathetic to Jesus, or whether he was simply who ended up with the short end of the string because his tomb was nearby and the Sanhedrin wanted him to do this, obviously that's impossible to know. I think either of those is plausible, but whichever the case is, Joseph of Arimathea agreed to bury Jesus in his tomb temporarily to resolve the situation of needing to abide by Jewish law, plus ensuring that the Romans weren't, that the disorder didn't disrupt the Romans or cause other problems. He agreed to this temporary burial. Store the body in his tomb, which was nearby, for one night, remove it as soon as you can to get it out of the family tomb, because the tomb was for family use and it would have been expensive. He didn't want Jesus to stay in there. Now, I've defended this reburial hypothesis, which isn't novel to me. People have argued for it before. I've defended it in a number of debates and discussions, and there's a number of responses that are typically made by apologists. So the first is that it's not typical for reburial like this to happen, for like temporary storage. This is against Jewish custom. Now, at the outset, I will say, yes, it's not normal for bodies to be temporarily stored and then removed. That is unusual. However, it's not completely unheard of or inconsistent with Jewish law. So reinterment due to risk of tomb robbery or water damage is acceptable in Jewish custom. You can check the Encyclopedia Judaica, which I reference for this. Also, the Gospels even give us a reference of this, because in John 20, Mary says, when she discovers the empty tomb, "They have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." It's unclear who they is referring to, but presumably whoever buried Jesus in the first place. And so she seems to think that reburial is at least plausible. It's not beyond the bounds of consideration for her. And likewise, whoever wrote the Gospel of John, and wherever that testimony comes from, even if like Mary is mistaken or something like that, the point is that the Gospel records an idea that someone at that time thought that a reburial was plausible. So whoever's reading the Gospel, writing, and then the audience of the Gospel seems to also think that it's at least not crazy that someone could think that the body had been reburied. Whether or not Mary was actually correct is not the point. The Gospels themselves present this as a live option. So although it wasn't normally what was done in Jewish context, another context, by the way, is in which reburial does occur is when there's a temporary military burial and then the graves can be moved and the body returned to a more acceptable permanent location with the family. So there were a number of reasons why reburial could occur, and Joseph of Arimathea could have appealed to any of these to justify the reburial if there was any questions about propriety. You could have said, well, there's a risk of tomb robbery, which, as I'll argue, there was a risk of tomb robbery. So the other thing that I'll mention is that the fact that it's not normally what happened is not a very convincing reason against it. Remember that the alternative hypothesis here is that Jesus was resurrected, and that's certainly not what normally happens. Reinterment of bodies does sometimes happen, and given the context that I've argued, it's plausible that it would have happened in this context. Resurrections, as far as we know, never happen, or maybe they do in this one specific case. That's, the point in contention. And I think that the reasons to think that the reburial happened in this context are far greater than the reasons for thinking that a resurrection happened in these contexts. So I think that this argument that it's not typically what happened, it just doesn't really get to the heart of the matter. The fact is that we're trying to explain why the tomb was empty. It's plausible to postulate a removal of the body, given the circumstances and given background knowledge that we know that it at least happens sometimes. The Gospels report it as a live option. There's reason from the circumstances as to why it could have occurred. So I don't see the great implausibility here. Now, a different argument against reburial is that the disciples would have known if Jesus' body had been removed and reburied. To which I say, I have no idea why people say this, because there's absolutely no reason for Joseph to have told anyone about this. According to the hypothesis, he was just doing his duty, either what the Sanhedrin or the Romans told him was his duty, or what he perceived his duty to be, depending on exactly who was the primary driver here. But the hypothesis is that Joseph felt that this was the right thing to do, to try to prevent a riot, to try to ensure Jewish custom was fulfilled. He did what he thought was the right thing, or was pressured into doing. And subsequent to that, he didn't want to have anything further to do with the fringe Jesus movement and the troublemakers that it contained. So why would he have told them anything? There's just no motivation there. And furthermore, even if Joseph did tell them that he removed the body, there's just no reason why Jesus' followers would have believed him. Why would they? The idea is that they've already found the empty tomb. They've already had experiences of the risen Jesus. The hypothesis is, and if you look at the timeline in the Gospels, that the appearances to Mary and Peter would have happened on the same day at least the first appearances happened on the same day as the empty tomb was discovered. And then the appearances to groups happened within a few days after that, possibly up to a week. The timeline's a little unclear, but it's very soon afterwards. So by the time Joseph finds out that the disciples think that Jesus was raised from the dead and saying that he'd been resurrected, the disciples have already been convinced that Jesus was the Messiah and died for our sins and was resurrected, or at least they have a set of ideas that are building to that. So why would they change their mind because someone they don't know tells them, oh, I moved the body? And this relates to something we'll talk about later, which is irrational belief persistence. In fact, I think that there's overwhelming psychological evidence from other religious traditions, from experimental evidence and from psychological studies, that people in this sort of context who have a very strong reason for believing that they had seen Jesus, who had a powerful personal experience and had a strong cognitive motivation to cling on to, to justify why Jesus was killed when that's not what they'd be expecting, they're going to believe their own version of events, which is that Jesus was resurrected. They're not going to believe someone they're not familiar with telling them that he moved the body. So I think this argument that disciples would have known about the removal is wrong for two reasons. It's wrong because Joseph had no reason to tell them, and it's wrong because even if he did tell them, then it wouldn't have been convincing. The disciples would have continued to believe that they had a special experience with Jesus, and they wouldn't have been convinced by him telling them, no, I moved the body. Now, there's another argument, a sort of related argument that Craig and others have made, that the Romans would produce the body in response to the disciples' teaching that Jesus had been resurrected. Now, I think, again, this is a very silly argument that breaks down as soon as you think about it. Bodies decay very quickly, especially in the environment of, around Jerusalem at that time of year. So it would have been unrecognizable in a matter of days. That is far too soon. We know the disciples didn't start teaching about the resurrection of Jesus after a few days. It took them a few weeks. So by the time anyone even finds out that they think this, the body's already unrecognizable. So there'd be no purpose at all in showing it publicly. And that's assuming, by the way, that anyone could locate the body, because the assumption here that I've made is that Joseph removed the body and placed it in a common burial site somewhere. He probably wouldn't have even known exactly where. Like, his servants would have done that for him. They wouldn't have, I think, kept track of exactly which place they put the body in. There'd be no reason for them to do that. He was a criminal. They didn't care. So why would the Romans know where the body is? Of course, they could dig up any old body and just say it was Jesus, but then that's the whole point. Why would anyone believe that was Jesus when there'd be no way to verify this? Of course, you could look for crucifixion wounds, but there'd be plenty of crucifixion bodies, so that wouldn't be convincing either. But more to the point, this would have never happened anyway because the Romans would never have cared about this. The Romans didn't persecute the early Christian movement at that time. They did later, but people get mixed up with the timeline. Persecution for the early Christian movement only came from the Jews because they regarded them as blasphemers and heretics. The Romans didn't care about Christians until they understood them to be different from the Jews. The Jews refused to make sacrifices to the emperor, which the Christians continued to refuse that. The Jews had a special exemption from that and special taxes that they paid, and the Romans begrudgingly allowed that because they were troublemakers and their religion was very old. The Romans respected antiquity. But they didn't, as soon as it was recognized that Christians were distinct from the Jews, those special allowances were not made to the Christians because the Christians weren't seen as an ancient religion in their own right. They were just seen as a weird, deviant practice. Who refused this very basic request to make these sacrifices to the emperor. So the point is, there was no Roman persecution of the Christians within a few weeks of the resurrection. That only started much later. So the Romans would have simply no reason at all to care anything about this. The only reason they cared about Christians in the first place is because they were concerned that they were making trouble and talking about someone being king of the Jews and stirring up unrest amongst other Jews who regarded them as blasphemous and so forth. Dragging a body through the street to make a religious point, whether or not it was actually Jesus' body or someone else's, would have stirred up heaps of trouble. That would have been grossly disrespectful to Jewish custom. Even if it was a criminal dragging a body through the street, that would not have gone down well. And it would have caused big unrest for people who were on the side of Jesus and not on the side of Jesus, and would have just been a very disruptive public display. Why on earth would the Romans ever do something like that? It's never going to convince anyone who believes in Jesus, and that would be very clear. Why would it convince anyone? And it's only going to cause trouble. So it's a lose-lose situation for the Romans. So this is something that sounds good when you say it in a debate, but if you think about it for 5 seconds, you realize that it makes no sense at all. There's no reason the Romans would have cared about this. Even if they did, they would have never done something like this because it would never have convinced anyone. And the ironic fact is, even if they had done this, there's no reason that anyone would have recorded it because the Christians would have just written it off as a stunt that was completely unconvincing. They knew they'd seen Jesus, right? They had an experience with Jesus, so that wouldn't convince them. And no one else would find this of relevance. So, there wouldn't be any records of it. We have hardly any records of first century Judea, right, or Palestine. And this event would have been lost to history, almost certainly, right? The Christians would not have cared to record it, and why would anyone else be interested? So even if somehow the Romans had done this, I don't think we would have historical documents of it. But of course, they never would have done it because there'd be no reason to do it. It would only be problematic. So I think that these arguments against the plausibility of reburial just don't hold water. Now let's move to the other candidate explanation for the empty tomb, which is the idea that Jesus' body could have been stolen. I think either of these are plausible options, so I'm going to defend both of them. We know that tomb robbery was a common risk in the ancient world, and there were many steps taken to guard against it. Jesus was a prominent public figure, so relic hunters would have been motivated to obtain either pieces of his body, which were widely used as relics, or possibly clothing, or anything else they thought might have been valuable that may have been left in the tomb. Some apologists say that there was nothing of value left in the tomb. I think that's silly because any piece of cloth or even piece of the body of Jesus would have had value to some people. But also, even if the tomb robbers didn't know there was anything valuable, they could have still been motivated to steal the body to check for anything valuable, any relics that might have been left there, or jewelry or anything that followers may have placed there. You never know, right? But I think more likely they would have just been looking for cloth or his pieces of his body. In fact, we know the women were going to Jesus' burial site to anoint him with oils, which could have been valuable. So that's sort of another reason potentially for robbery. Another point that's sometimes raised is that no one knew where Jesus' tomb was except for Joseph of Arimathea. But this is obviously wrong because the women knew where Jesus' burial site was. They went there on the Sunday morning. So other people could have also known or found out. I just want to emphasize here that there's no contradiction here between saying that Jesus's burial site was known and was known and therefore could have been robbed, and what I said before that Jesus' burial site was private and that was the reason why it was chosen. There is, of course, a major distinction between somewhere being private and out of the way and relatively secluded and the site being entirely secret. So the women seem to have followed the burial of Jesus. They followed his body, and that's how they knew where it was. But the crowds didn't follow, and it would have been difficult for them to follow, presumably because of the location in which it was. So a motivated person could have found out, but it was out of the way enough for the crowds not to have been as much of an issue. So the site was secluded, out of the way, private, but not secret. And so it could easily have been robbed. And it seems indeed that there are many examples from both history and fiction of tombs being found and robbed. So I don't really think that we can say that this is a seriously implausible hypothesis here. Now, something that some apologists say is that the guards at the tomb that Matthew reports would have prevented a tomb robbery, or potentially even a reburial. Now, the first thing I'll say about the guards is that, come on, do we really think that there were guards at the tomb? This is an obvious apologetic insertion. For example, Matthew records private conversations between the chief priests and the Pharisees that no one would have known about. So where did Matthew get this information? I suppose you could say God revealed it to him. But if God revealed that to him, couldn't God have revealed a few other points that Matthew is in sharp disagreement with the other Gospels? That might have been a little bit useful for us. But anyway, you can speculate to no end about what God may and may not have revealed. But on the historical point of view, this is fairly implausible that this conversation would have been known about. But more to the point, it's very implausible that the chief priests and Pharisees would have met at all to conduct business on the Sabbath, which is what is reported in Matthew. I know Matthew's point is that they're hypocritical, but it's just not historically plausible that they would have done this, particularly because this was, them discussing things in public. They would have had to have walked there to conduct this business. People would have seen them. They were not... they were well-known people, and it recalls them talking with the Gentiles as well. This was especially forbidden on the Sabbath, and again, that would have been known about. The Gentiles would have observed it. So that's not something that would have been readily kept secret, and it's just incredibly implausible that would have happened in that context, that they would have violated the Sabbath in such an obvious public way. So I don't think that there were any guards at the tomb. But look, even if, all right, the approach we're taking here to grant as much as we can, even if there were guards at the tomb, it kind of doesn't really make sense anyway. And ironically, some apologists have actually noted this and argued that this is evidence in favor of the historicity of the guards, because if it was an apologetic insertion, it doesn't make any sense, because the guards were only placed at some time on Saturday, clearly during the day on Saturday, but it's not clear exactly when. So robbery was still possible, tampering with a body was still possible, because any time between when burial occurred, which was around the sunset, around the beginning of the evening on Friday, and whenever the guards were placed at some time on the Saturday, robbery or tampering could have occurred during that interval. So guards don't even prevent robbery. So it doesn't even make sense on its own terms, even if you think that there were guards. So it's really just puzzling all up how to understand this, regardless of what assumptions you make. And the final point that I'll make here is that a sanctioned removal would not be prevented by the guards. The guards would have presumably been informed that Jesus' body was being removed, and they would have allowed Joseph or his servants to remove the body. They may have even continued to be stationed there to prevent any tampering with his private tomb. He wouldn't want people going around and poking around his tomb, trying to remove the stone or look for relics or whatever. So in that sense, actually, it's more plausible to me that the tomb would have been guarded from Joseph's point of view after Jesus was removed to prevent anyone from tampering with it than the story that Matthew gives. But the point is that sort of removal would not have been prevented by guards. Only robbery would have been prevented by guards, but only after the guards were in place, and there was time before that. Another hypothesis, of course, is that the guards perhaps didn't take their job entirely seriously and may have been amused or bemused by other things, such as jokes or wine or falling asleep, which is indeed what Matthew reports. So there's so many ways around the guards hypothesis that I just think that it's not a credible counter to the hypothesis that the body was stolen. All right, so we've seen two plausible candidates for how the tomb could have become empty. The body could have been removed intentionally by Joseph of Arimathea, or it could have been stolen by tomb robbers looking for relics. Let's now move on to trying to explain the appearances of Jesus following the empty tomb. Now, I said that the hypothesis that I make is that beginning with probably Mary and Peter, I say probably because the Gospels are a little bit unclear about the exact details of which women were at the tomb, but for the sake of argument, let's say Mary and then Peter, I argued that they experienced an individual bereavement-induced hallucination of the risen Jesus following seeing his empty tomb. Now, we know that bereavement hallucinations, which occur to a loved one of someone who's recently deceased, bereavement hallucinations are very common. So there's one study here which looked at the general population in several Western countries, found that about 40% of the sample reported some sort of hallucinatory experience of a recently deceased loved one. Another study found that half of subjects felt the presence of the deceased, and about a third either saw, heard, or reported speaking to the deceased. I've just got a study on the left there as an illustration there, and a very interesting case on the right. Now, one point that apologists sometimes make is that, sure, bereavement hallucinations are fairly common, but it's very rare for people to actually believe that their deceased loved one is still alive, which is what happened in the case of the disciples. Now, this is true. However, it's not unheard of that people can come to believe that their deceased loved one is still alive. There's this interesting case here of an otherwise apparently psychologically healthy 26-year-old male who was so emotionally attached to his mother that he began to first report experiences of her still being around and like speaking with her, and then actually developed the belief that she was still alive or still around in some capacity. But the patient seemed otherwise well, and so the doctor seemed to be at a bit of a loss as to what to do in that situation. So it's a very interesting case study if you're interested. So even in non-institutional, ordinary contexts, it is known that sometimes people can develop the belief that their loved ones are still alive. That's rare, of course, but in the case of the early Jesus movement, we're not talking about an ordinary context. So I'll come back to this point later about why specifically we see that the disciples coming to a belief that Jesus was still alive. Experiencing a bereavement hallucination is not sufficient for that, but I'm saying it's a prerequisite. It was the first step there. And so bereavement hallucinations are very common, so it's not at all an unreasonable postulate, especially when you're considering the number of women and male followers. In fact, it's actually quite statistically likely at least that one of them would have seen and or spoken to Jesus, especially after seeing the empty tomb, which is a very provocative event that may have further precipitated that. So let's move now to accounting for the group appearances of experiencing the risen Jesus. And for here, we need to appeal to more mechanisms, because I want to emphasize at the outset that there is not really such a thing as a group hallucination or a collective hallucination or a mass hallucination, as the term is sometimes used. Hallucinations are a private psychological phenomenon. However, there are known in the psychological and sociological and historical literatures collective experiences that more than one person reports of seeing something miraculous or supernatural or out of the ordinary, which cannot be explained by, or at least we think probably cannot be explained by that perception being veridical. And so I'm going to call these collective experiences of Jesus or of other phenomena as appropriate, rather than mass hallucinations. But I have a quote here, which is from this sort of seminal study about these sort of collective delusions or experiences. And I think that it sort of nicely summarizes some of the mechanisms that give rise to these sort of events. So I'll read here, quote, "The same set of factors which operate for a single individual in the induction of hallucinations may become even more effective in an excited or expectant crowd, and on occasion may result in mass hallucinations." So parenthetically here, I don't like this term mass hallucinations, but this is a terminological point. I think everything else they say is applicable here. So back to the quote. "This is not to say that any two people are capable of having precisely the same hallucination, identical in every respect, but similar preconceptions and expectations can undoubtedly result in hallucinatory visions so alike that subsequent comparisons would not disclose any major discrepancy. Dissimilar hallucinatory experiences often attain a spurious similarity by a process of harmonization in subsequent recollection and conversation," end quote. So this quote here, I think, really does a good job at summarizing the key mechanisms that are operative when we have these collective experiences of an unusual phenomenon. In particular, there's the idea that multiple people do not hallucinate the exact same thing. What they do is separately hallucinate or have experiences of things that are similar enough such that they don't notice any discrepancies. And then any discrepancies that did exist are harmonized through a process of collective and reconstructive recall and group socialization effects. So we'll talk about these processes in more detail, but this is the essential idea of what happens, is that individuals have essentially simultaneous hallucinations, but not shared directly, but they also construct interactively with each other at the time an experience, but then also that experience is reshaped through memory, which harmonizes the experience and smooths over any differences. So let's go through some of those mechanisms in a bit more detail. So one of the important processes that is at work in generating these experiences at the time is self-reinforcing attentional processes. This has been studied particularly in the case of hauntings and poltergeist-like episodes. So the argument is that they're often products of contagious reactions to ambiguous, either environmental or cognitive events. So environmental stimuli being some sight or sound or something in the environment. A cognitive event would be more like a feeling or a sense or a mood or something like that. So reading from a study here, quote, according to this multivariate model, the labeling of ambiguous events as abnormal or paranormal initiates the reactive process, which is subsequently sustained by perceptual contagion, i.e. flurries of paranormal observations due to self-reinforcing attentional processes, end quote. This is from a study here that looked at haunting phenomena. And the idea is that when people are in a context where they have this expectation, they'll make an observation on the basis of some kind of ambiguous event, external or internal, which is like, oh, did you feel this or did you see that? Which then brings someone else's attention to it, who then, on the basis of their context and the other person mentioning it, then focuses on it and is primed to also interpret that in an abnormal or like paranormal or supernatural way, which then makes it more likely that they'll notice something else, which then is a self-reinforcing process as it says here, perceptual contagion, that people build up, bouncing off each other to progressively amp up the status of what they're seeing and what they're feeling and what they're experiencing. So suggestibility is a key element here. So people, for this to work, generally have to have an expectation about what they're going to experience, and some people are more suggestible than others. So here's a quote from a study that looked at this in the context of an experimental chamber that was built to see if they could simulate these sorts of abnormal experiences and sensations. Quote, participants were required to spend 50 minutes in a specially constructed chamber within which they were exposed to infrasound, complex EMFs, both or neither. A considerable proportion of the participants reported a number of anomalous sensations in response to a fairly mild suggestion that in our white, round, featureless room, they might feel some unusual sensations, end quote. So just to clarify here, so the subjects were placed in a completely featureless white room with nothing in it, and nothing happened to them. Infrasound and EMFs don't affect people, physiologically at least. But there was simply a suggestion given that you might experience something strange. And what they found is that a large proportion, not everyone, but a large proportion of the participants reported some strange sensation. Here's a different study which looked at a different context. So this was a house that was constructed to be haunted, right? So, quote, previous researchers asked 2 volunteers to keep a diary for 30 days of unusual events of the type that are traditionally associated with hauntings and poltergeists in a residence with no prior history of such activity. As expected, the instructions themselves were sufficient for the volunteers to note, with increasing frequency, anomalous or unusual events, presumably simply because the volunteers were primed to notice them. The most parsimonious explanation for our finding is in terms of suggestibility, end quote. So there have been a number of studies that have looked at this in different contexts, and what they find is that many people are highly suggestible, some more than others, and can readily report anomalous experiences in context simply when they expect it and have that suggestibility, and particularly in a group context where they can play off each other through the mechanisms that I just mentioned about self-reinforcing attentional processes. Let's talk about the effects of social discourse and how the way that events are discussed and shared with each other in the context also is important there. So this is another study looking at how paranormal investigators construct these events. So, quote, the social organization of memory and how speakers work up events as paranormal. This study is discussing the social organization of memory and how speakers work up events as paranormal. It is argued that the process of remembering is a social rather than individual one. Therefore, the focus is on how remembering gets done in talk and how speakers collaboratively create descriptions of events. Furthermore, examining the rhetorical organization of talk is not to suggest that participants deliberately deceive. Rather, this article is concerned with common sense communicative practices and the ways in which accounts are jointly negotiated and constructed. This is very important because it's emphasizing here that when speakers are constructing these events in the way that they talk and drawing attention to certain things and remembering afterwards, they're not deliberately being deceptive. This is really just a process of how people use expectation and suggestion to shape what they see unconsciously, and then how they draw attention to things that they think are important, and then how they interpret those things in the context of their worldview and what other people have told them. So again, this is a good paper that discusses some of those issues and describes how people can come to believe things are happening that aren't actually happening on the basis of the interactions between them, drawing attention to things, understanding them, how they talk about them, bouncing off each other. Here's an example of this in a religious context from the case of explaining Pentecostal healing. So this is a really good paper. I strongly recommend looking at this if you'd like to understand how these sorts of supernormal or paranormal or supernatural experiences can be generated through sociological and psychological processes. Quote, in Pentecostal healing services, very impressive miracles and healings are routinely produced. Paralytics arise from wheelchairs, cancerous ulcers disappear, legs grow, cavities are mysteriously filled, and the deaf suddenly hear. Drawing on a case study and qualitative interviews, this paper offers a sociological, mechanism-based explanatory scheme for the observed phenomena. It is argued that a number of social techniques, such as suggestion, rhythm, and music, context factors like audience size and the beliefs, and causal mechanisms, probability, latency, selection, and editing effects, are combined in an ingenious way in order to produce miracles and healings. End quote. So this mentions a number of things that we mentioned before, such as the suggestibility and prior beliefs of the audience, as well as the social context, like the rhythm and the music and the high energy of the environment, and selection and editing effects refers in part to the attentional selection processes we talked about. The article goes into a number of details to argue about how these are put together, again, in largely a subconscious way, as we talked about before, social discursive effects and memory contamination. We'll get to the memory aspect later. But here we're focusing on the event itself, how these processes are combined to lead people to essentially generate an experience together with other people that is not necessarily, where their perceptions of what happened is not veridical of what actually happened. They believe that something supernormal or paranormal happened, where in fact that's not what really happened. Now, these mechanisms that I'm talking about expectancy and suggestibility and self-reinforcing attentional aspects and the discursive components and so forth, these are not just hypothetical. We have many examples of people making claims of experiencing miraculous events in groups from a wide range of religious traditions and as well as non-religious contexts. I outline a number of them in my book, many of them in my book. I'm just going to mention a few here for the purpose of illustration. So Sabbatai Zevai was a 17th century Messiah claimant who had a very large following. It was a very prominent movement, and he had many miracles credited to him, which are reported in large group context. Anandamya Ma was a Indian guru who likewise had a very large following, and many miracles attributed to her, which are well documented. Menachem Mendel Schneerson is another Messiah claimant more recently who also had a large following, and interestingly still does have a large following. Some of his followers continue to believe that he was the Jewish Messiah, even following his death, and there are a number of reports of appearances to his followers following his death. Simon Kimbangu was a early 20th century Christian figure or some sort of charismatic religious leader. I don't know exactly what his theology was, but he operated in the Belgian Congo, and unfortunately, a lot of the documentation is in French, but his claims and miracle claims are also quite well documented. We have Sathya Sai Baba. He's probably one of the most famous. He only died quite recently, but he was an Indian guru figure who there's so many accounts that you can find online of his claimed miracles and healings and all sorts of things. I cite some of them in my book. And finally, I think one that's really interesting, this is this guy, Bruce Grindle, who died a few years ago. He was an American anthropologist, not a religious figure, but he reports in one of his academic papers, in an actual journal article, he talks about an experience he had while engaging in field work. I think it was in Africa somewhere. I may have got that wrong, but he reports an experience during some sort of tribal ceremony or music festival or something, that he observed, or he recalls experiencing someone rise from the dead and begin dancing. So from what I understand, Grindle doesn't think that actually happened, but that is what he recalls experiencing there. That is what he reports. So that is a very interesting case if you're interested in looking that up. There are also cases of mass hysteria that we know from historical records, and this is not quite the same. This is not based on a single figure who's like a miracle worker or something like that. These are events in which many people report experiencing a similar phenomenon or experience, even though there's no actual objective evidence of any real phenomena underpinning it. The Seattle windshield pitting epidemic was an interesting one, in which there was a widespread flurry of people observing previously unnoticed windshield holes, pits, and dings on cars. the angels of Mons. So this is an apocryphal tale of angels being seen in the trenches of World War I that was repeated at the time shortly after it allegedly happened, and then for many years afterwards, and still to this day it's shared, despite the fact that there's no evidence of people actually making this claim happening to them. It's all like people sharing the story of it, which is strange because you'd think people would be able to verify this, but people just keep sharing it, right, without any actual without any sort of primary source. N-rays is a fascinating one. So N-rays do not exist, but they are a form of radiation that was hypothesized to exist in the early 20th century. And what's interesting about them is that many different labs allegedly independently confirmed their existence. It was just sort of found later that they all misinterpreted evidence in various ways. Like somehow they were all finding something that didn't actually exist. Very strange phenomenon. German air raids on Canada in the First World War. This was interesting because there was a flurry of reports and widespread belief that there were German aircraft being seen over Canada during World War I. And we know that this is impossible because the Germans didn't have any aircraft that had remotely the range to reach Canada during the First World War. So it's unclear exactly what all these people were seeing, but it definitely wasn't German aircraft. And I think the most fascinating example is genital shrinking epidemics, of which there have been quite a number, especially recently in Africa. But there are many reports of this throughout that have been documented, which is a widespread belief amongst males that their genitals are shrinking due to some sort of disease or infection. And the strange thing about this is you'd think that it would be very easy as a male to know that your genitals weren't actually shrinking, but somehow this belief persists and seems to spread, when it gets going in a particular context. So the psychology about how these mass hysteria occur is very interesting. It's, as I understand it, thought to relate predominantly to selective attention and social contagion. So someone draws attention to this, oh, have you noticed so-and-so? There's an underlying cultural context that's supportive of this, like the scientific context of N-rays or the German air raids over Canada, or sort of a combination of lack of scientific understanding and traditional religious beliefs and genital shrinking epidemics. So there's a social context, there's plausibility, there's expectation, and there's the selective attention, and then there's a reinforcement effect of other people are reporting it, so then you think it's true, and then you worry about it, and so forth. So we know that these sorts of processes are at work in mass hysteria, and likely are at work in other contexts as well, like miracle claims. There are a number of cases from parapsychology about people experiencing usually apparitions of the dead in group settings. In particular, the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research, which is still around, but the society was particularly active and prominent, had actually quite a lot of prominent scientists and researchers involved in the late 19th through early 20th centuries. Sidgwick, a well-known mathematician, was involved in the early days. So they did a lot of work compiling cases around this time, and I've had a look through their archives. It's very interesting. They have a lot of very interesting reports. So here's one that I found. Quote, in March 1846, the wife and two adult daughters of Dr. R, in their home in West Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, all saw at the same time an apparition which they instantly and independently recognized as the doctor's mother, who had died 10 years previously. The apparition conformed with a promise made by the old lady before she died. Mr. Owen, who was an investigator, secured an account of the story direct from the elder daughter and afterwards secured confirmation from the mother. Both the mother and the daughter recollected the precise dress of the apparition, and their accounts agreed entirely that the apparition had crossed the room, approached a portrait of the doctor, fingered to look at it, recrossed at the door, and inexplicably vanished, end quote. I think it's interesting here that we have some of the features that we see in Jesus' appearance in some of the gospel accounts of him appearing somewhere and being observed by multiple people, interacting with something in the environment, in this case a painting, and then just sort of vanishing. So that's a very interesting account, and there's more in the reports as well. That's just one that I've picked out. So as I said, there are many more examples that I give of these sorts of miracle claims and supernormal or paranormal accounts you can find in my book if you're interested in more. I've just picked a few here to look at. Now, why do these cases matter? Why are they important, and how do they relate to our case? So my argument here is that proponents of the resurrection hypothesis face a dilemma in response to these cases. If these other cases, or most of them, are veridical, meaning that when people reported seeing a ghost or a poltergeist or seeing a spirit or whatever other miracle or healings or whatever else that is reported, if those are veridical, then it seems that appearances of someone who was dead or some other miracle aren't sufficient evidence to convince us of messiahship or a special divine status, or necessarily convincing enough that a resurrection occurred, because we can have appearances that are not indicative of, say, the person being the Messiah or having a special divine status, or even having been resurrected, right? Because, again, many of these appearances are, in fact, most of them are not alleged to be resurrection. Certainly not the type of resurrection, not just revivification, but like a divine and restoration of the body in a sort of a supernatural and new revitalized form, right? So if the other cases are veridical, then it seems like even if Jesus did appear to the disciples, that just doesn't really tell us anything about whether he was the Messiah or whether he was resurrected, critically. Like, he could have appeared to the disciples just as some sort of visionary appearance or through some other mechanism. Because again, if you think that these other cases are veridical, apparently that happens. On the other hand, if the other cases aren't veridical, then the proponent of the resurrection hypothesis, I think, owes us an account of how it is that people in these cases can report seeing things, like seeing the dead, or other delusions that aren't actually veridical, at the same time without appealing to mechanisms that would also account for the resurrection. So what I'm saying here is that the resurrection proponent needs to be able to explain these other cases through naturalistic processes, but they need to do so in a way that falls short of also explaining the resurrection appearances through naturalistic processes, because that would undermine their case. So they need to be, their mechanisms need to be just good enough to explain all the other cases, but not quite good enough to explain the resurrection. And I don't think that really works without a lot of special pleading as to why the resurrection claims are like super special. I just don't think they are, right? So either way, whether the resurrection proponent thinks these other miracle and supernatural cases are veridical, or whether they don't think they're veridical, I think they face a problem. If they're veridical, then we can just say that Jesus appeared to his followers as some sort of vision or a spirit or apparition without saying that he was resurrected or the Messiah or anything else. And if they're not veridical, then we need to be able to account for them by appealing to naturalistic processes. But we don't want to appeal to too many processes that will also account for the resurrection, because that's going to undermine the case in the resurrection. So it's unclear how that's supposed to happen. So I think that this poses a real dilemma, because the fact that we observe this range of other cases is a problem for proponents of the resurrection hypothesis. They have to deal with them in some consistent way. By contrast, the RHBS model appeals to common processes that can, in my view, explain all of the cases. Not every mechanism is going to be as relevant for all cases, and obviously there's differences in the specifics, but the basic process is there of a context in which the miracle or supernatural claim becomes relevant. Then hallucinations, bias to socialization, those other mechanisms can account for how these beliefs came to arise. Proponents of the resurrection hypothesis can't do this. They have to single out the resurrection as being special in some way. So I think that provides the RHBS model with a greater explanatory scope with respect to the resurrection. Now, there's a rebuttal that's sometimes given against the idea that the experiences of the risen Jesus were produced through sociological process and expectation and things like that, because it is argued that even skeptics were convinced. It wasn't just the disciples who expected to see Jesus. Maybe the processes could work with them, but even skeptics who didn't think Jesus had risen were convinced. So it must have been something very powerful that goes beyond what we can account for just by selective attention and discursive effects and socialization and things like that. Doubting Thomas is the classic example of this. So in response to this, my view is that Doubting Thomas, the appeal to Doubting Thomas is a literary motif. It's an avowal of prior skepticisms. This is well known in paranormal and supernatural contexts. I'll read out this quote. Quote, "The avowal of prior skepticism is a narrative device designed to enhance the credibility of the narrator and the likelihood of attribution of the event to a paranormal cause." Or here we could add supernatural. "The technique works like this. A typical narrative account starts with the avowal of prior skepticism. At first I was skeptical, followed by a description of an anomalous occurrence. But a psychic told me things she could not have known, which in turn is followed by a conversion. I realized that something out of the ordinary was occurring. This technique highlights the strength of the evidence that caused a change in the narrator's attitude from initial skepticism to belief. By highlighting the narrator's reliance on evidence, the account also positions the narrator as a rational thinker." End quote. There's actually a few papers on this, and it's a very widely seen narrative narrative device and storytelling mechanism that's used to again, I'm not saying deliberately to deceive, but that's used, I think, unconsciously a lot of the time to highlight the credibility of an account and to highlight the impressiveness of the evidence. And I think that's exactly what we see. It's a classic example of this in the report of Doubting Thomas and elsewhere, where it sometimes talks about skeptics. I think Doubting Thomas is the main example here. Now, I want to emphasize here that we don't have to assume that Thomas is like lying about being a skeptic, or that whoever it is that reported this testimony that ended up in the Gospels, whatever eyewitness we think that went through. Remember, I'm assuming that we have eyewitness testimony that reports this. We don't have to assume that they're lying about Thomas being skeptical. All that we have to understand is that the reason they report it in this way is because it's a narrative device, and they think that it is sufficiently accurate to describe this in this way, such that it is reasonable to say so. So all we need to do is have a situation where Thomas and or someone else comes to understand his experience as being initially skeptical, but then later being convinced. We don't have to assume that Thomas actually was like really skeptical and actually required really strong evidence and was like asking probing questions and like demanded verification from a second source or whatever. We don't actually have to assume that Thomas was like that. And in fact, I think no reason to believe that he was. All we need to hypothesize is that Thomas subsequently came to believe that his experience was so powerful that is what overcame his doubts. And this narrative device, whether this is something that Thomas came up himself as a way that he started to speak about his experience, or whether this was later developed by whoever it is that reported the tradition to the gospel author, it doesn't matter. Either way, it amounts to the same thing, that Thomas and or other disciples came to understand Thomas's experiences and reported his experience using this avowal of prior skepticism. And that is what we see in the Gospels. We do not need to postulate that Thomas actually was some sort of dyed-in-the-wool skeptic who really was convinced by the strength of the evidence. Now, another response that's sometimes given to the idea that these appearances in group settings were sociological and psychological constructs is that, well, if these processes could lead to these appearances of Jesus, why did the appearances suddenly stop around day 40, the ascension? You know, Jesus ascends to heaven and there's no more resurrection appearances. There are other like visions and other things that happen later, but no more sort of resurrection appearances per se. So how can we understand that through naturalistic processes? Well, my argument here appeals to work of Rodney Stark, who has investigated different factors that determine whether new religious movements will be successful. He studied movements like the Mormons and other new religious traditions. He argues that, quote, as these movements become successful, new religious movements founded on revelations will attempt to curtail revelations or at least to prevent novel heretical revelations, end quote. The idea here is that any movement that's based on a revelation or series of revelations must have some mechanism, or must at least develop some mechanism, for controlling what counts as a veridical, bona fide, official, or accepted revelation from those that don't. Otherwise, they'll see a proliferation of revelations and there'll be a loss of control over orthodoxy and proper practice and organization. Again, I'm not saying that it means that people in these movements sit down and say, hey, we need to devise a mechanism to curtail novel revelations, but I'm saying that this is a process and a social factor that's relevant in new religious context and was also relevant in the origination of the early Christian movement. Because of the pressures and the need to distinguish what is a real appearance of the risen Jesus, like a resurrection appearance, and what is not, they came to understand a definitive event that marked the end of the resurrection appearances as being his ascension. Anything before that, any appearance to the disciples, counts as a resurrection appearance. Anything after that maybe was a vision or something else, but wasn't a resurrection appearance in the same way. So we have clear reason for expecting this under a naturalistic process, that there would be not necessarily that it would occur at exactly the way that the ascension describes, but rather that there would be some endpoint that the disciples would come to understand marks the culmination of Jesus's appearances, and anything after that would have a lesser status. That this is a known impetus and a known factor that drives the development of other religious movements as well. It's exactly what we expect to see in the case of the early Christian movement. And in fact, as I'll argue later, the ascension is not what you would expect under the assumption that Jesus is a special messenger to all of mankind. If so, why does he only hang around for a few weeks and then leave? But this is what you would expect from appealing to a sociological processes, that new religious movements need to have these cutoff mechanisms for differentiating the different statuses of revelation and controlling the development of doctrine. So that concludes the discussion of the psychological mechanisms that generate that initial collective experience of the risen Jesus. We talked about expectancy, which obviously was generated by the empty tomb and the bereavement hallucinations of Peter and Mary, plus the religious context in which they were operating and wanting to understand what happened to Jesus. Self-perpetuating attentional processes, the discursive processes that are operative and people talking to each other and building that experience off each other, and other mechanisms that we discussed in which collective experiences of something paranormal or supernatural are constructed in the moment in groups of people. But we shouldn't... we should be clear at this point that we're talking, those processes give rise to an initial experience, but that's not that initial experience is likely not going to be the experience that's recorded in the Gospels. Further processes are also operative between the initial experience and the actual writing down of that experience in the Gospels, and namely we have memory and cognitive biases that are also operative after the experience concludes and before it's written down. So I'm now going to talk about these memory and cognitive biases and the role that they play in generating the accounts we find in the Gospels. So first we're going to talk about the fallibility of eyewitness testimony. This is important, of course, because the disciples' reports of their experiences are based on eyewitness testimony, and there's a lot of evidence that eyewitness testimony can be very unreliable, particularly in certain contexts. So let's talk about a well-known case here of a rape victim. Quote, even as her attacker shoved her down onto the bed, pinning her hands behind her, even as her head exploded with revulsion and fear, the 22-year-old college student knew exactly what to do. She would outsmart her rapist. She would remember everything about this night, his voice, his hair, his leering eyes. She would trick him into turning on a light. She would study his features for scars, tattoos, anything that would help identify him later. She picked out his eyebrows, his nose, his pencil-thin moustache. She picked out his photo. A week later, she sat across a table from 6 men holding numbered cards. She picked number 5. That's him, she said. In court, she later put her right hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. She had never been so sure of anything before, end quote. So this is referring to the case of Jennifer Thompson Canino and Ronald Cotton, who was the alleged attacker that she picks out. And in fact, despite how confident she was, Cotton was not actually the perpetrator. He was convicted and served a number of years in prison, but he was later exonerated on the basis of DNA evidence. This is one of many well-known cases in which, maybe not well-known enough, in which eyewitness testimony of witnesses who were extremely confident in their identification turned out to be incorrect and turned out to have misremembered or misidentified people, and people were wrongfully convicted. So they jointly wrote a book about this called Picking Cotton, if you're interested in looking up more about that case. In addition to eyewitness testimony being generally unreliable, there's also additional phenomena of memory distortion and contamination. So I'll read a quote here. Quote, in contrast to laboratory-free recall, which emphasizes detailed and accurate remembering, conversational retellings depend on the speaker's goals, the audience, and social context more generally. Retellings of events are often incomplete or distorted, with consequences for later memory. Selective rehearsal contributes to the memory effects, as does the schema activated during retelling, end quote. So just a note here, the schema is sort of like the template or cognitive maps that we have that help us to understand the world. And so the concern here, or the aspect that's being appealed to here, is the idea that when we remember something, we don't just remember the events as they happened. We remember them through a model that we have, or through sort of assumptions, background knowledge, a schema that we have to help us understand that situation. And so we can invent things or distort things so that they fit the schema without realizing it. That's just sort of how our memory works. Selective rehearsal is also another relevant factor there, because certain things we retell over and over again, those retellings reinforce those aspects of the memory and can also reinforce mistakes that we make or memory contaminations that have come from elsewhere. So the more often we rehearse something, the more inaccurate it can sometimes get. And this quote here is particularly relevant because studies of laboratory-free recall, which are emphasizing detailed and accurate remembering, aren't necessarily the best ways of studying the accuracy of memory in a social context where we have very specific goals and audiences and purposes in mind, and where often once we start to misremember things, we compound that by continuing to rehearse and repeat that contaminated or inaccurate memory. So here's another quote relating to this. Quote, these authors found that 76% of participants came to remember seeing non-existent film footage of the sinking of the passenger line, the Estonia. When they heard that a Confederate so someone who was trained to cooperate in the experimental context, the Confederates say that she had seen footage of the film, compared to 36% of those who did not hear the Confederate report seeing the footage. Hence, memory conformity effects can occur for significant emotional and autobiographical events, end quote. I've just put a few references here to the papers that I quoted from, and another one as well. So this study here about the seeing the liner Estonia is a particularly interesting one, because the idea is that it's not just for something that is trivial or uninteresting that people might misremember, but for significant and emotionally laden events, like seeing a passenger line sink. Even without any Confederate effects, 36% of participants in the study reported seeing footage that did not exist. And when a Confederate reported having seen it, the amount doubled to 76%. So a majority of people will report remembering seeing a footage of a liner sink just from suggestion and having someone else also corroborate that they had seen it. So this is an example of a memory contamination effect. Someone remembers something because someone else reports remembering it, and then that can lead to you confusing the familiarity of that with actually having remembered it yourself. There's many, many studies that have demonstrated this effect. Before we get to cognitive dissonance, so the relevance of this to the appearances to Jesus is very clear, because the disciples would have discussed these events with each other in the days, weeks, months, years afterwards. They would have recounted them many, many times to each other, to friends, to family, to people they're preaching to, and they're not doing that in order to be particularly concerned about accuracy. I mean, the Gospels also make this clear. They're doing that to convince people that Jesus was the Christ, that Jesus really did rise from the dead. There's a very clear audience, very clear social context there. And they're doing it in a way that reinforces all of them what each other says, in a way that promotes conformity of a consistent account, or at least relatively consistent. These are precisely the environments in which memory distortion and contamination from one person to another is very likely to occur. So it's the exact environment in which the disciples were rehearsing and sharing their testimonies and their beliefs about what happened, that we have reason to think that there's most likely bias and distortion of their memories. Now, that doesn't mean that they invent everything whole cloth. Remember, the idea is that there were initial experiences that they had, but then there were significant distortions and contaminations of those experiences, which means, for example, that if two individual people had slightly different hallucinations of seeing Jesus say or do something different, or remember different things based on what they were attending to at the event and things like that, because the event was sort of a constructive process. It's not like they were all just sitting there staidly watching Jesus. The hypothesis is, based on other accounts like this, that it was a dynamic, high-energy, interactive process of pointing things out and discussing, and maybe different people having hallucinations of different things or misperceptions. The disciples have genuine memories of that process. They're not inventing things completely, so memory is somewhat accurate, but it's significantly distorted and contaminated on the basis of the goals that they had and their own beliefs and interactions with each other. And we know that that occurs and is in fact quite common even for highly emotive types of events. Again, if you can get this strong effect from just watching the film of something, imagine how much stronger it could be in terms of the amount of contamination and the confidence that you had in that memory from an actual experience that you had with your friends in a highly emotionally charged religious context. Now, let's move to cognitive dissonance, which is another important mechanism that would have been operative after the initial experiences. So cognitive dissonance is a phenomenon in which people try to reconcile two apparently conflicting beliefs that they have as a way to avoid this uncomfortable state of dissonance of holding these two beliefs. So here's a quote relating to this. Another famous example was the 1844 so-called Great Disappointment, following the failed prediction of the Millerites that Jesus would return in that year. There were many attempted justifications, some fell away, but the movement continued and gave rise to the contemporary Seventh-day Adventist Church. One form of such rationalization that occurs following these disappointments has been described by religious scholar Gordon Melton as spiritualization. You may recall I talked about this previously, about the idea of the second coming, and that's when Jesus will fulfill his prophecies about the Messiah that he didn't fulfill the first time. So this is the mechanism I was referring to. So back to the quote. The prophesied event is reinterpreted in such a way that what was supposed to have been a visible, verifiable occurrence is seen to have been in reality an invisible, spiritual occurrence. The event occurred as predicted only on a spiritual level. And there's a book that talked about this by Festinger, When Prophecy Fails, but there's been many other papers that have discussed this issue as well. I think that this is another important factor that we need to consider in understanding how the disciples came to believe in both the appearances of the risen Jesus and that he'd been resurrected. Because remember, as Craig discussed in that quote that I mentioned near the start of the video, Jesus' disciples did not expect that. They thought he was the Jewish Messiah. They did not expect him to be killed. They did not expect him to be embarrassed by the Roman and Jewish authorities and crucified and then buried. They expected him to triumphantly restore the throne of David and to restore the Jewish people to their homeland and to get rid of the Romans and all of that sort of thing. So their expectations and hopes were dashed when he was killed. Cognitive dissonance would have been highly operative in most, if not all, of the disciples there, because on the one hand, they have this belief that they had been following the Jewish Messiah and devoted their lives to him and spent all this time with him and seen all these miracles. And on the other hand, was a belief that the Jewish Messiah would not be killed while Jesus was killed, right? So how do you reconcile these beliefs? Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, but the Jewish Messiah is not supposed to be killed. Well, it's very clear that developing the belief that actually the Jewish Messiah could be killed, and he would be killed because God wanted him to be killed for our sins, but he would be resurrected as a vindication of this fact and as a triumph over death, and that all of the remaining things that the Messiah is supposed to do will happen later at a second coming. That's, I think, exceptionally clear as a case of cognitive dissonance. It's a retroactive justification that allows these two beliefs to be reconciled with each other. There is every reason for the early disciples to have developed a belief something like this, not necessarily had to be exactly this, but the beliefs that they did end up teaching clearly fit the bill for what would serve to reduce cognitive dissonance. They didn't have to change their mind about Jesus being the Jewish Messiah. Their hopes and dreams were actually true. They just turned out to be realized in a bit of a different way than they had originally thought. So this mechanism can clearly explain why there was a change in the belief system and how it is that the disciples were strongly motivated to develop some sort of understanding that Jesus wasn't actually dead. He was still alive. He'd been resurrected and appeared to them. So there's very, very strong motivation for the disciples to come to a belief like this. And this is one of the things that differentiates the disciples' experiences from many other cases, because there's such a strong religious context where cognitive dissonance and expectation would have been very strongly operative. Let's talk about another relevant cognitive phenomenon, irrational belief persistence. This is another thing that I mentioned earlier. Quote, consider the belief in magic rituals, healing crystals, shamanic powers, and so forth. In such cases, the effects are typically used to retrospectively determine the activity of whatever invisible cause is dictated by the belief system. Such and such must have happened to account for the observed effects. Any apparent failure, then, can be explained away by arguing that apparently the intervention was not of the right type, or not performed properly, or interfered with by another invisible cause, etc. And this is the paper that I've pulled this from, which talks about the epistemic rationale of self-validating belief systems, and emphasizes how irrational belief persistence can work in practice. Of course, we have many examples of irrational belief persistence. I don't think that should be controversial. I'll give some examples in a moment. But the underlying cognitive mechanisms, I think, are also quite interesting. As discussed in this paper here, they talk about how usually there's an idea that whatever it is that was thought to happen or was predicted or initially believed must have been subverted or averted by some unknown hypothesized cause. So, the intervention wasn't of the right type, or something else happened to prevent it. So, again, this is very clearly operative, I think, in the case of the belief in the disciples that Jesus had been resurrected. Because the Messiah wasn't supposed to be killed and died, so why did it happen this way? Actually, it must be because God had a hitherto unknown and unexpected purpose for Jesus. It was to die for our sins, right? So we hypothesize an unknown supernatural or divine cause or purpose. And then another unknown mechanism, which is that he was resurrected. And beliefs like this are so readily modified with additional ad hoc postulates, which is what this paper talks about here. So this is how, for example, if Joseph of Arimathea did tell the disciples, hey, I moved Jesus's body, like I can show you where it was buried, although I guess you won't be able to recognize the corpse anymore, but I can tell you where I moved it. It's highly likely that they wouldn't have believed him. They would have thought he was a liar, or they would have thought he was sent by the devil, or they would have come up with some other excuse, right? there's ample evidence that this is what people do, particularly in the context of cognitive dissonance and very strong personal experiences. Peter believed that he'd seen the risen Jesus appear to him in what I've argued was a bereavement hallucination. He saw the empty tomb, and then he had collective experiences with the other disciples. Cognitive dissonance is pressing him hard to now think that these events the best way to make sense of these events is that Jesus really was the Messiah and died for our sins and has been resurrected. Why would he then believe some person he doesn't know who's telling him that he reburied Jesus, or whatever other evidence might have come forth that contradicted his account? That's not often how people work. There's a paper here that talks about this on the presumed fragility of unconventional beliefs. This is a really good paper. I strongly recommend this. This talks about how some people, particularly I think scholars, have this sort of rationalistic idea that people who have really weird, bizarre, unconventional beliefs must hold to them fragilely, and that if they were only shown the error of their ways, if only they saw evidence, that they would readily be convinced otherwise. But this just isn't the case in the vast majority of instances, that unconventional, bizarre beliefs that have overwhelming evidence against them are often extremely robust, that people can see evidence and just not be convinced at all. And so there's no reason to think that the disciples would have been dissuaded by Joseph telling them that he moved the body or other evidence that might have contradicted them. Once that these processes got going, they are highly self-sustaining. Once these belief system becomes entrenched, it has a strong resistance to change. Here are some examples of irrational belief, persistence, and action. So this one is from an experimental context of induced through in a classroom context of psychic performances. So, quote, an accomplice presented 3 common magician's tricks which resembled psychic performances to 6 introductory psychology classes. In the 2 classes comprising the psychic condition, the instructors skeptically introduced the accomplice as an alleged psychic. In the strong magic condition, an amateur magician would perform stunts which resembled psychic phenomena but really weren't. So then what they did is that they assessed belief of the participants through free-form written responses in the form of feedback to the performer. The proportion of occult belief was above 50% and far exceeding magical beliefs in each experimental condition, even though, as indicated by a manipulation check, subjects in the magic conditions heard and understood the instructor's assertions that the accomplice was a magician who would be faking a psychic performance, end quote. So, you can read the study in more detail there. I had to truncate the explanation just for brevity here. But the idea is that they wanted to see how many people could be convinced that there was a genuine psychic there. And they wanted to compare conditions when they tell the class, this is a psychic, but, introduce skeptically, like, well, this guy says he's a psychic, right? Versus the condition where they say, this guy is a magician, it's all fake, right? So there's 2 different conditions, and they want to see in what proportion of people think that there is real magic occurring in either of those cases. And the point is that in all of the cases, a significant proportion of the audience reported believing that the magic was real, and they did a number of checks to verify and to indicate that they think that these were like real reports. They didn't think it was an experimental effect. You can read the paper yourself to decide whether you think that those are reasonable, but I think that it was quite well done. And the interesting thing was that this large proportion of people in the audience believing that there was like real magic being performed even existed in the case where they introduced the person as a magician who would be performing fake magic. There have been other studies that have demonstrated this as well, that you can perform a magic trick to people, tell them it's just tricks, it's just sleight of hand and so forth, and many people will still believe that there was some real magical supernatural thing going on. This is an example of irrational belief persistence. People somehow can't believe that there was a sleight of hand there, and instead they form or strengthen an existing belief that there was magic, and they won't budge from that no matter what you tell them, even if you show them how it was performed in many cases. Here are some other examples of irrational belief persistence in action. Andrew Wakefield, a scumbag who illegally experimented on children through a discredited study which he alleged provided evidence that vaccines the MMR vaccine specifically caused autism, which it did not show. The interesting part, though, is that he still, to this day, has ardent followers who put themselves and their children at risk by foregoing vaccinations or altering the vaccination schedule, despite the fact that he has been overwhelmingly and thoroughly refuted and shown to have performed the experiment in a completely inappropriate manner and not used proper protocols and so forth. Essentially, it was entirely fabricated. And his subsequent work has been refuted as well. The evidence is absolutely overwhelming and indisputable as anything can be in that case, but people still believe him. They still follow him. and they still put themselves and their children at risk. Breatharianism is particularly crazy. This is the belief that one can survive without food or water just by breathing air and some sort of mystical interaction with light. This has been documented to result in at least some deaths, and other people becoming, very skinny as a result of practicing this diet. It's fringe, of course, but you can find people starving themselves to death because they believe they can survive without food or water. If that's not irrational belief persistence, I don't know what is. Holocaust denial, I don't think I need to say anything more about that. The evidence is absolutely overwhelming, but you still have a lot of people denying this. Flat Earth, again, what more do I need to say about that? Interestingly, there was a stuntman called Mike Hughes who died in a rocket accident, ostensibly trying to get high enough above the ground to photograph the flat Earth disk. This case is interesting because whilst it's sometimes reported that he died because of his flat Earth belief, it seems that this is not true. It seems that he probably wasn't really a flat earther. He just used that for publicity. What he really was a stuntman, a daredevil. And he would have done things like this anyway. He just used the flat earther thing as a way to get publicity. Now, that's all well and good. What's interesting about that, though, is that if you imagine that there were Mike Hughes followers who were writing about this decades later, and you didn't have records from anyone else, they would have portrayed Mike Hughes, in the relevant context, in the right way, as like a martyr to their cause. They would have said that he died trying to prove the Earth's flatness, and he was some sort of hero, right? We have enough documentation to show that that wasn't the case. But what I'm arguing here is that you actually have to be very careful when people say that the disciples died. This is something I haven't much discussed, but if they say disciples died for their belief in the resurrection, it's very hard to establish that. We don't even know what happened to most of the disciples, but the fact that someone died and that they also preached a belief that was widely ridiculed and that was potentially relevant to their death, that got them in trouble, doesn't necessarily mean that they died for that belief. And Mike Hughes is a good example of this. He did die by putting himself in a risky circumstance, and that was related to a belief in the flat Earth. It's not clear that there's actually a causal relationship there, but you can absolutely see someone describing it that way if they were so motivated. So there's an interesting interaction of irrational belief persistence and the reasons why people do things. And so we have to be careful about how we combine those things. But the point here, anyway, is just to emphasize irrational belief persistence is a very well-known and documented phenomenon. And some apologists who talk about the disciples as if they were hyper-rationalistic, proto-scientists, and they only believe things with the best possible evidence and checks, just does not fit with the overwhelming evidence we have about how most people think and interact and how they form their beliefs, especially in any sort of social religious movement or spiritual context. So that concludes the discussion that I wanted to make about the RHBS model, the cognitive biases and socialization effects. Now, let's put these elements together and combine them in a way that specifically addresses the resurrection hypothesis, and also sort of tie up a few loose ends here. So one concern that is sometimes raised about the RHBS model is, if you're right, and all of these psychological and sociological processes operated to produce belief in the resurrection and distort memories and things like that, and eyewitness testimony is not reliable, doesn't that prove too much? Doesn't that prove that our memories or perceptions never reliable or hardly ever reliable? And that just seems implausible, right? It seems like I'm proving too much, some people say, by citing this sort of evidence and arguing that it could generate belief in the resurrection. These people say that perception and memory is usually reliable, and it's ad hoc to just argue that only in the miraculous cases it's unreliable. So I don't think this is ad hoc at all, and I think we can establish this on the basis of the psychological evidence here. In normal context, memory is often reasonably accurate or accurate enough. I think that memory is actually often much less accurate than we think. It's just that we often get by well enough in ordinary cases. There's enough checks and balances on us, feedback from the world and other people to keep us on the right track. But notice that I emphasize here normal contexts. That is a little hard to specify exactly what that is, of course, but I mean in context where we're used to operating, where there's a lot of feedback, where we have a lot of knowledge about how things work in that context, like of ordinary objects, circumstances that we encounter regularly. And particularly when we encounter different people who share that context with us. In these sorts of contexts, memory is reliable enough. But in unusual circumstances, the mechanisms that keep memory reliable and keep it on track are not operative in the same way. We don't have the same checks. A very good example of this is UFO sightings. People apply their perceptual cues that they use and heuristics to assess the distance and speed and size and shape of objects that is usually effective in many contexts. They apply it in contexts like looking up in the clouds at night, or seeing shapes that move past them very quickly, or looking at photographs and other things, or seeing a shape move against a sky with no contextual clues present. They apply it to contexts in which perception is not used to dealing with. It's an unusual context, and their perceptions go awry. The same applies with memory. There are specific unusual circumstances which are known to facilitate the formation and consolidation of false memories. And these include a highly charged religious, or I would add spiritual or ideological context. So it's not just some arbitrary thing that happens. There's a very specific context for it, a reason why people are led to form these specific beliefs. Expectation biases, or expectation effects, and a supportive social context. So these three things, I think, are what specifically makes it the case that in the context of the resurrection, as well as in other cases of paranormal and supernatural reports, when you have these three elements, there may be others as well, but at least these three elements contribute to the mechanisms that I mentioned being operative and leading to these unusual reports being made that are not typically operative in normal circumstances. So let me just briefly go through the relevance and cite some evidence in favor of these factors here. So first, a highly charged religious or like spiritual or paranormal context. So Jesus was an eschatological teacher, which means that he taught about the end times, or the coming of a new age. Barnum here talks about an apocalyptic prophet. There's some disputes about the use of the word apocalyptic because that's actually a literary device or context. But the fact that Jesus had many eschatological teachings is not really disputed. He declared himself to be the Messiah. He talked about the coming of God's kingdom, the defeat of Satan, resurrection of the dead, restoration of Israel. These are all eschatological teachings, the end of an age, the beginning of a new age, the radical reshapings of the earth. This presents a very clear religious context, and a context in which the disciples are expecting these things to happen. Exactly when they expected them is somewhat unclear, but the point is that this provides a very distinctive context in which the disciples are going to be expecting big things to happen. Ordinarily, we don't think that these sorts of big things, these massive eschatological changes or spiritual events of huge significance, we normally don't think these are operative. When people do think these events are operative, that's when we see things like the Pentecostal healings or the poltergeist appearances and apparitions, some of the examples that I cited before and many others in the literature. That's what I'm trying to emphasize. It's the context that provides much of the important underpinning for the cognitive and sociological distortions to become operative. They're not usually relevant because we're operative in a normal context. We don't expect these sorts of things to happen. We're not using that sort of cognitive schema to think about and understand our experiences. Jesus, of course, was also known for healings, exorcisms, and challenging religious and political authority. There's a few studies here about charismatic religious leaders and popular prophetic movements, and it talks about their operation and how there is a strong sense of community and people really derive a lot of identity from their religious context, and it really does shape the way they think about things and their expectations. Have a look at them if you're interested in understanding these sorts of contexts more. But the point is, these sorts of religious contexts aren't like every other context. It's not like just walking down the street and meeting your friend there or reporting what you had for breakfast. This is a very distinctive context. I'm not saying it has to be like a messianic context. This was the specific Jesus case. But in contexts like this, where you have a very particular ideological, spiritual, or belief system that is shaping how you experience things, that changes dramatically the cognitive schema and the expectations and other things that shape how you experience and how you remember those experiences. And this relates to the second point about expectation. So I'm just going to flash up a bunch of papers here. There's so much research on this, that religious experiences or paranormal or other sort of experiences are massively shaped by expectation. So people experience things when they expect them, when someone's told them to expect it, when their religious context leads them to expect it, when it's suggested by an experimenter or some other authority figure. And there's even evidence from this study on the top right here that when there is when there is some sort of threat to a religious belief or religious meaning, that can actually increase belief in miracles, which is an interesting one. Obviously, that would be relevant to the disciples. So there's a lot of evidence that people's memories, and particularly these sorts of supernatural experiences, are strongly shaped by expectation. Note here that this is one thing that clearly distinguishes ordinary from non-ordinary contexts. In ordinary contexts, you expect things to go the way they normally go. And in an ordinary context, that is useful because it's ordinary, so it does go, normally go the way that it normally goes. And so our expectations, the cognitive schema, our attentional processes, they all help us to remember things accurately because normally they do go that way, in most contexts that are ordinary. But when there's a different schema and a different context activated that's out of the ordinary, then those processes are not so helpful. And we can very quickly go off track when we're having a very different sort of expectations and a very different mindset approaching that experience. And finally, the social context. So this is the aspect, this also relates to the S in the RHBS model, the socialization component. I mentioned this a bit before, but religion in particular, as well as other types of belief systems, are very important to people. They're not just things that you happen to believe. They're not just a belief in your worldview, that they're central to many people's worldview, particularly those involved in new charismatic religious movements. And there are a number of studies that discuss this I've got some paranormal and religious cases here, how important these identity forming mechanisms are and how that shapes how people interact with each other. People don't just form these beliefs and remember them individually. They form them and remember them and consolidate them in a social context. That social context provides a great deal of meaning for people, and they are encouraged to therefore maintain that environment, maintain those connections, and sustain that belief. Raising skeptical doubts or other things is not something that's readily done by most people in those contexts because it's very difficult to go against the grain and to argue against or speak out against things that everyone else that you know and care about, or most of them, also believes and is so important and central for people, especially if you'll be accused of being lacking faith or of being influenced by a demon or something like that. So this social element cannot be underestimated as well. It's not analogous to ordinary beliefs about what you had for breakfast or who you met yesterday or things like that, which don't have such a essential, or at least usually don't have such central importance to us. So what I'm emphasizing here is that there is a distinction, obviously not an absolute dichotomy, but there are differences in how we perceive and remember in ordinary context and the accuracy that has, and how we perceive and remember and the accuracy thereof in unusual contexts, and particularly in these highly charged religious contexts with that expectation and the social component. So that's why sometimes memory and perception can be very reliable and sometimes it won't be. It depends on the context in which it's deployed and what mechanisms are predominantly operative. And I think that we have ample evidence that in the context in which the disciples found themselves, following the death of Jesus with the cognitive dissonance, then finding the empty tomb, then with the bereavement hallucinations and all of that expectation, trying to make sense of it, having that close-knit community together, which then constructed those experiences, we have all of the ingredients there that promote formation of false memories, and then the further development of those false memories and consolidation and conciliation of those accounts as they share them with each other. All of the ingredients that are well documented to occur in other cases, many of them having been demonstrated in laboratories and through other surveys, all of them were present in the case of the early disciples. And so I think that it's very plausible to argue that their belief in the resurrection, as well as their reports of the appearances of Jesus to them, were developed through these cognitive processes. Now, the next thing that I want to do, which is something that's a bit new, is to go beyond just talking about generic collective experiences, which is what I've been discussing so far, and actually get down to details about what I think actually happened in response to the specific claims made by the Gospels. So again, this is a bit different to what I've done before, where I don't get into this level of detail, because in previous accounts I've not assumed that the specific passages in the Gospels necessarily represent what the disciples would have claimed their experiences were. In other words, in the past I've argued for a certain amount of legendary development by the Gospel authors or whoever the Gospel authors got their accounts from. But now I'm making a stronger assumption. You recall my initial assumption. I'm going to assume here that the Gospels were either written by eyewitnesses, or at least that the testimonies that they have about the resurrection appearances were informed directly by eyewitness testimony. So that's a much stronger assumption, and I don't actually think it changes very much, which I think is one of the things I want to argue here. So I'm going to go through a concordance of the Gospels, and particularly the empty tomb and resurrection appearances, and talk about what I think happened. Again, under the assumption that all of what it reports in the Gospels relating to these events is obviously not necessarily what happened. I'm not assuming that these events all literally happened, obviously. What I'm assuming is that what the Gospels say happened is what the relevant eyewitnesses would have reported at the time the Gospels were written, which is even let's say 10 years afterwards, Gospels were probably written later than that, but even if, say, 10 years afterwards, even if you think the Gospels were written in the 40s, right, a crazy early date, I think that's more than enough for the mechanisms that I outlined to be operative. You only need a few years, and maybe even less, but a few years is ample time for the memory distortions and recall biases and things like that. So that's what I'm assuming here. Everything that the Gospels say regarding empty tombs and appearances and so forth, according to the assumption I'm making, accurately depicts what the eyewitnesses in question reported in the decade plus following these initial events. Okay, so then I'm going to give an account as to how we can account for this without appealing to any miracles, with using the resources I've discussed in the RHBS model. So let's begin at the start. Joseph buries Jesus in the family tomb, and the women follow and see its location. This is reported in all 4 Gospels. Okay, no disagreement there. So let's move on to the next point. The women come back on Sunday morning to anoint the body. This is also reported in all 4 Gospels. One interesting phenomena, which has been noted by many critics and I guess apologists alike, is that the Gospels don't agree with each other about how many women came or exactly what they did or who saw what, how many angels there were and things like that. I think that you can account that through memory distortion, that different eyewitnesses remember different things and reported slightly different things. This is actually exactly the sort of distortion that you expect. People aren't very good at remembering details. They remember the gist of things. And this is a defense that's actually been made by many apologists, that it doesn't matter that much that the Gospels differ on certain details. I think it kind of does matter in some ways, but I'm not going to get into that debate here. The point is that this doesn't really differentiate the resurrection or the RHBS model. I think we can just say, look, there was some amount of memory distortion. Different eyewitnesses remembered things differently as to exactly who was at the tomb. I don't think that matters overly for the purposes here. So let's move on. And remember, I'm assuming that the tomb was empty, so I'm assuming that those events did happen. I account for the empty tomb by the reburial by Joseph of Arimathea. That would have occurred prior to Sunday morning, so that's easy to account for through what I've discussed already. Now, the next event is that the women see that the tomb is empty and reportedly see one or more angels. Again, there's differences between the Gospels as to how many angels there were and who exactly saw them. After seeing the angels, at least some of the women run to tell the disciples. So, as I've argued before, I think that at least one and maybe more of the women experienced a hallucination of angels that was triggered by the emotions of the context, obviously, the bereavement and the religious context and excitement, as well as seeing the empty tomb. So this could be considered a bereavement hallucination, or maybe it doesn't technically count because it's a hallucination of an angel rather than Jesus himself. But regardless, the angels were giving information about what happened to Jesus, so I think that it still sort of counts as a bereavement hallucination in that context. Anyway, the exact nature of it is not that important. The point is that we know that hallucinations in a bereavement context are very common, and we have the additional factors here of the highly charged religious context, of the expectance that Jesus wouldn't be killed, and so trying to make sense of that, and also of just seeing the tomb empty. So I think that those things in combination with the baseline plausibility are all more than enough to account for why at least one of the women had a hallucination at that point of an angel saying something to her and appearing to her. That appearance, of course, may have been different to exactly how it's reported in the Gospels, because then we have subsequent recall and recollection of the event, retellings of it, which then shapes the memory, can increase its impressiveness over time. People can remember details, and it can be contaminated by what other people reported. We'll get to that later. But there was, I think, an initial hallucination triggered by seeing the empty tomb and with the other context there. Then, Luke and John both report that Peter and another disciple confirm that the tomb is empty. I think actually one of the Gospels just says Peter and the other mentions another disciple. That doesn't matter very much. At least one of the disciples, let's say Peter, confirmed that, so the women come and tell them, they then go, they confirm the tomb is empty. There's nothing extra I have to hypothesize there. That's fine. So moving on. There is then a report of Jesus appearing to Mary in the garden nearby or at the tomb, which then she reports to the disciples. Now, this is the first instance where we have what's called the non-recognition motif. I'm going to come back to this, but this is something that we see in a number of these appearances where initially the person does not recognize Jesus, but then at the end it says, oh, and they realize it was Jesus. I think that all of the instances of non-recognition motif are actually later confabulations due to memory distortion, that the people did not actually have that experience at the time, that they remembered it later on, they confabulated it later on. But I'll get into that a bit more detail. So the next actual appearance, in the sense of event that I think did occur at the time that it was reported, was the appearance to Peter. This is only recorded in Luke, and no details are given. It just says he appeared to Peter. But I think that the plausible explanation again here is that when Peter went to the empty tomb, so the women see the empty tomb, one of them has an appearance of an angel. Some of the others run to tell the disciples. The disciples then come, or at least Peter comes, and he sees the empty tomb for himself. And I think at that point, possibly slightly afterwards, it doesn't much matter, Peter also has a bereavement hallucination of Jesus, which is triggered by the empty tomb and the women's accounts. So by that point, it's unclear exactly when this happened, and so I don't know if Peter knew, for example, about Mary saying that she had an experience of Jesus. I suspect that she didn't at that point, because I think that that event was a later confabulation, though we don't know how much later. Hard to say, because the accounts are a bit unclear about the exact timeline. But the point is, at the very least, Peter at this point has seen the empty tomb, and he's heard at least one of the women report their accounts of having seen an angel. On the basis of that, plus the bereavement and religious context, he then has, either that day or maybe it was the next day, but soon thereafter, he has his own bereavement hallucination of Jesus appearing to him. So that's not an independent event, it's triggered by experiences of the women, which in turn were triggered by the context in the empty tomb. So there's a causal effect here, a series of causal events that are all related to each other. So at this point now, we've got the empty tomb, the disciples and women know about the empty tomb, we've got an appearance of angels, and we've got an individual appearance of Jesus as a hallucination to Peter. The apparently next appearance that's reported only in Luke is the appearance of Jesus to two disciples on the road to Emmaus. And here we also have the non-recognition motif. I believe that this appearance did not actually occur, in the sense that I don't think that there was even a hallucination at this point. There may have been, but I think that the non-recognition motif is actually best understood as later confabulation due to memory distortion. I'll come back to this once we go through all of those non-recognition motifs. The next event that I think was historical was the appearance of Jesus in Jerusalem to the group of the disciples while they are eating. Actually, so Luke and John both mention similar sorts of events. I think that these probably both refer to either exactly the same incidents, or possibly there was a series of such experiences, probably in the same place with similar groups of people. Hard to tell whether they're the exact same event or just like in a sequence, but I think it's much the same thing. Luke and John report many similarities. Luke mentions eating, John doesn't, but it's from the context they could have been eating, or maybe they sometimes had food and otherwise didn't. So I think that this was actually like the primary collective experience of the risen Jesus. I think it was the first one. I think it was a collective ecstatic experience of Jesus triggered by emotion, the women's accounts, as well as Peter's bereavement hallucination that he'd had. I think that the best way to understand this experience is similar to Pentecostal religious healings, as well as some of the accounts of hauntings and poltergeist and spiritual sightings that I've mentioned in previous accounts. So I think that obviously we don't know exactly what happened, but I don't think that the initial experience was exactly as it's reported in the Gospels. Remember, I think that the Gospel accounts come from after years of recounting these events and discussing them with each other. I think the initial event was very high energy. So the disciples at this point, remember, they have the empty tomb that they've, at least some of them have seen and presumably all believe in. They have accounts of angels being seen by at least one of the women, and they have Peter's hallucination, Peter's account of seeing the Jesus to him, appear to him. So the disciples are now expecting, there's that expectancy that they're expecting a revelation to them. They're expecting Jesus to appear. They're trying to make sense of what happened. That cognitive dissonance is highly operative. They want to figure out how Jesus could have died but also be the Messiah. They have this social context of a close-knit group of people who are all together trying to figure this out and supportive of each other. They have, I think, also probably been fasting. They've been praying a lot. They probably haven't been sleeping well. They're scared. They're afraid, but they're also hopeful that they might be able to see the risen Jesus. I think that the initial context was highly emotionally charged. They're probably very excited. Maybe they were singing, like praying together. Then we have, I think, an initial triggering of the event through those reinforcing attentional processes. Someone says like, in fact, it probably starts internally. It probably like, do you feel this? Do you feel his presence? I feel his presence. We have those discursive phenomena that I talked about, where people construct through discourse with each other how an event develops and an understanding of what's happening based on their worldview, based on their prior assumptions, based on their expectations. And then we have the self-reinforcing attentional processes become operative as everyone begins to feel the presence of Jesus, and then someone identifies something, whether it's a hallucination or whether they misidentify the light or something, impossible to say, but they say, do you see that? And it says, yes, I see that, brother. And then they play off each other in developing a belief that they're experiencing Jesus appearing to them and then maybe speaking to them. So this probably involved individual hallucinations. Remember, we talked about how people don't need to simultaneously hallucinate the exact same thing. They hallucinate similar things in that shared context simultaneously or close in time to each other, and then build the experience together through self-reinforcing attentional processes, through the discursive effects, as well as through memory contamination, which begins even at the event itself, as people suggest experiencing something and others falsely remember having experienced that themselves. They begin that even in the process of the event itself. And this is all fueling their expectations, coherent with their worldview that they're trying to understand what happened to Jesus, and is in line with what they are hoping to account for in line with the cognitive dissonance. And so I think that this is the sort of thing that happened in this initial experience. And there may have been a sequence of these in maybe the same place, maybe wherever they were gathered together. Possibly there was one main event, possibly there was a sequence. Again, the Gospels aren't very clear on this, but once it's happened on one occasion, it's very easy to see how it could have happened a second time. Luke's mentioning of Jesus eating, perhaps that was something that the disciples came to believe at that time, just like people can come to believe in their genital shrinking, or seeing aircraft that don't exist, or seeing healings that didn't in fact occur, or seeing ghosts that presumably weren't there. So perhaps that happened at the time, or perhaps it was due to a later memory distortion that someone falsely remembered seeing Jesus eating. It's very easy to see how that could have occurred, because how exactly would the disciples have known if there was less food on one plate than another after the event versus before? As in, it's not like that they would have kept careful track of who ate what. All that needs to have happened is someone noticed, was there less food on this plate than previously? Jesus must have eaten the food. And once someone suggests that, everyone now remembers, maybe not immediately, but someone mentions this later or at the time or later, doesn't matter. Someone mentions it, then people falsely develop the memory of having seen Jesus eat the food. Maybe initially they just believe that he did eat the food, later they confabulate actually having seen him eat the food. This is exactly the sort of process that we have documented. Remember the case of Line at Estonia, for example. People remember seeing it sink when they didn't see it sink. A third of them even just with the prompting, 75% of them with additionally someone else having reported it. So these sorts of confabulated memories are very easy to incorporate once you have the process going, and when you have the context here which is friendly to that sort of confabulation, and when the belief is reinforced by the context. So this, I think, was the key experience here that really got the belief going in the resurrection. Was this, it wasn't the first, but it was the first group experience of Jesus appearing to it, which I think we can understand as an ecstatic experience of Jesus appearing to the disciples inside in a room where they were praying and fasting and praying and discussing with each other, trying to understand what had happened. They were probably at it for a very long time and very tired, and this was the culmination of what they'd been hoping to experience. So that's how I think we can account for this experience. All of the things that I've hypothesized there, the mechanisms, are all well documented by the processes that I've mentioned in the RHBS model. Now, the next experience that we have here is reported by John, the appearance of Jesus in Jerusalem with Thomas present. So this seems to be a similar account. It follows on from John's earlier account where, so John says that initially there was this group appearance of Jesus in Jerusalem. Thomas wasn't present, and then there's another one when Tom was present. Luke doesn't mention this, but otherwise Luke's account is fairly similar, but he doesn't mention Thomas not being there the first time. So this is where the doubting Thomas event allegedly takes place. As I said before, it's not clear whether there was initially one experience, and maybe Thomas wasn't actually there, but later through memory contamination he came to think that he was there. That's very plausible. We know that these sort of false memories can very easily be implanted, so I think that that's entirely plausible. Thomas wasn't there, but he later came to believe he was there. That could account for why we have this skeptical narrative there, the avowal of prior skepticism. Thomas initially heard about this. He was skeptical, but then later he came to believe, and then he actually came to think that he was there and actually was skeptical there, but then saw for himself, and he repeated that story over and over the years, and then that was picked up and recorded in the Gospels. Or perhaps he really was there, and again, that was just how he'd understood his experience. He liked to think of himself as skeptical, but still was caught up in the excitement of the event, and also believed that Jesus was there. And then he reported that aspect in using that narrative device of the avowal to prior skepticism, which is very common. He himself reported that over the years, or maybe someone else reported it about him. Either way, that story was picked up and reported by John. So I don't think there's anything particularly difficult to account for in the John account. Whether that was the same experience or a slightly different one is a little hard to know, but either way is, I think, can be fairly readily accounted for by the processes that I've discussed. Next we have, also in John, a reported appearance of Jesus to the disciples while fishing in the Sea of Galilee, or Sea of Tiberias it's called. Here we also have the non-recognition motif. Initially they don't recognize it's Jesus. So here, this is the last non-recognition motif, and so I want to talk about this. So this is a very strange phenomena of people not initially knowing who Jesus was, but then later recognizing him. We see this in 3 of the 4 Gospels. Mark, John, and Luke all have at least one instance of this. Interestingly, not the same instance. Mark has Mary in the garden, as does John. Luke has the disciples on the road to Emmaus, and John has this fishing in the Sea of Galilee. It's a bit hard to understand why we see this non-recognition motif. If you think that Jesus really did appear to people, why didn't they recognize him initially? I think that that's really quite hard to make any sense of. Is Jesus playing this strange game of hide and seek? Like, why would he do it that way? I think that a plausible explanation, and I acknowledge this is a postulate. I don't know for this. It's speculative, but I think that it's a better explanation than I've seen anyone else come up with about the non-recognition motif, at least if you're making the assumption that this does reflect eyewitness beliefs later on, right? Which I'm doing here. I'm going to postulate that the non-recognition motif is present in those events that were later memory confabulations. And the reason why that we see the non-recognition motif is because in these instances, people are misremembering things from later on. And the non-recognition motif is the way that they've sort of distorted the memory to be consistent with what they actually did remember. So, for example, the road to Emmaus, I think, is one of the clearest cases of this, because we have 2 disciples who are walking along the road talking about Jesus. They meet someone who is like eloquent and who they talk with and get along with, and then later like stay over for dinner. And then effectively at the end of the event, he says, and then they realized that it was Jesus and he disappeared. So I think that everything in that account probably really did occur, except for the last part where they realized he was Jesus and he disappeared. I think that later on, when they were recounting this event, probably after the collective experience here, because Luke reports that this road to Emmaus happened just before the group experience in Jerusalem. So I think that plausibly what happened is that this initially, the disciples who were walking on the road to Emmaus didn't think that it was Jesus. This was something that they realized later, that they thought, hey, that guy we were talking to and had this nice conversation with and had dinner with, like, could that have been Jesus? Like, you know, and it's easy to understand how they could have thought this, because if they'd already thought that they'd seen Jesus, like later on, then in retrospect, they're interpreting their experience through the worldview that they have and through other experiences they've had. Now they think, you know, think about the way we felt during this experience. It talks about there, like it actually in the account, it talks about the way this man made them feel and things like that. They're reflecting on things that they thought and felt at the time and confabulating different things, maybe incorporating some aspects from later experiences. I think that this explains why the account is so odd. It's because most of it is an accounting of a fairly mundane event. It's only the last aspect where suddenly it was Jesus that they have confabulated and mixed with later events of seeing Jesus. And the reason they think that happened is because they think that could have been Jesus. Why wouldn't it have been? They felt like it was Jesus, and in retrospect, thinking about it, it must have been Jesus. Then they repeat the account many times. The account distorts a bit such that it's still not very coherent, but it's like a little bit more coherent, and they forget that they initially didn't actually realize it was Jesus, and there's really not even that much to be done there. All that they need to do is later come to think that it was Jesus and then forget that they hadn't initially believed that. That is a very minor distortion that's very readily accounted for in the literature on memory distortion and contamination. So I think much the same thing happened likewise with Mary in the garden. Whether it was she initially saw an angel and later came to think that was Jesus, or whether it was one of the other women saw an angel and then Mary then had memory contamination later on of also of not seeing an angel but actually seeing Jesus. But again, maybe she saw an angel, or maybe it was actually the gardener or something. And again, she in retrospect confused that with actually being Jesus. That's why, again, you see the non-recognition motif. Once again, I think that that's probably what happened, or plausibly what happened, under the assumptions that I'm making here, the assumption being that these all accurately report what the eyewitnesses thought years later, right? Under that assumption, we can plausibly explain how the account of the fishing in the Sea of Galilee in John as a similar thing. The disciples were fishing there. Many of them were fishermen, so that's not entirely implausible. They had this experience on the sea, and only later came to understand that actually this person that we saw there or interacted with was actually Jesus, right? So this is how I account for all of the non-recognition motifs. I don't think any of these events actually involved an experience or hallucination at the time. I think that it was only later in retrospect that those involved came to understand it as being an experience of Jesus. And I think that that is different to the case of John and Luke, who report the disciples together in Jerusalem. I think that was a collective ecstatic experience which really did occur at the time, as opposed to the other events, which were ordinary events subsequently reinterpreted and re-remembered as having this supernatural element. And I think that that accounts for why there's this non-recognition motif. Now, one of the, I think, interesting things about this hypothesis is that there only needs to be one core set of collective experiences, whether it's a literally single evening or maybe a sequence of events, but in like probably the same place over a fairly short amount of time, which is the disciples praying and eating together and trying to make sense of what happened in Jerusalem, and leading to those experiences reported by John and Luke, and also whether or not Thomas was present, again, as we discussed. So essentially these two rows on the table here. Those, I think, were genuine collective experiences. They did actually happen, though there were memory distortions subsequent later to them. And obviously I don't think that they were real miracles, right? I've explained what I think generated them, but I'm saying there was a real experience at the time. All of the other events, so Mary's appearance account, the road to Emmaus, as well as the Sea of Galilee, all I think were actually later confabulations where there was no experience at the time that would have been initially understood as an appearance, but that was subsequently reinterpreted, probably following this group appearance in Jerusalem, as an appearance of Jesus. That's where the non-recognition motif comes from. The only two other accounts we have that don't fit into these two categories is the reported appearance on the mountain in Galilee, which is reported only in Matthew and have almost no details about. This is very strange. It's not really clear why the disciples are going up a mountain in Galilee, but again, even if we take Matthew at his word here and that they really did go up a mountain for some reason, we can postulate that a similar experience took place on the mountain. Especially, it seems like that they're going up to the mountain not just for a hike, but probably to pray and to fast and to try to draw closer to God. That was, very common symbolism there, going high up on a mountain to get closer to God. So at that point, this is happening after the appearance in Jerusalem. So if this account is genuinely reporting eyewitness testimony, then presumably what happened is a similar ecstatic experience was triggered on the top of the mountain as was occurred in Jerusalem. Though I find this report is a bit strange given the sort of lack of details and why they're going to Galilee and only Matthew reports it. But even if, again, that's not a huge deal, we can still accept it and say it was a similar experience that now happened on the top of the mountain. The very last experience reported in Acts is the ascension. So Jesus, his disciples report seeing Jesus ascend into the sky, and I think that this can readily be accounted for, again, given that this is happening after all of the other experiences, as a distorted memory of hallucinations caused by staring into the clouds and sun. This is known to very readily trigger hallucinations, and when you combine that with the prior beliefs that the disciples had, which at this point they already believe Jesus is appearing to them, and you combine that with the self-reinforcing attentional processes and discursive process that I mentioned, plus of course memory distortion following the event, I think that essentially triggered hallucinations of seeing Jesus. It's even vague. It says that he ascended to heaven. It's unclear what that means exactly. Does that mean he levitated off the ground? I think that that's the way some people have interpreted it, but it doesn't actually say that in the passage. It's sort of vague. So I think that all the disciples needed to believe at that point was that they saw Jesus in the heavens in some way. And then they subsequently interpreted that as him ascending into heaven, thus marking the end of the resurrection appearances, which is exactly what we would expect to happen because that's how new religious movements work. They find a way, they interpret they develop a theological framework for distinguishing the more important from the less important, or the veridical from the non-veridical revelations. This appearance of Jesus in the sky was subsequently interpreted as marking the end of his sort of appearances on earth. Of course, there were like visions later, but those were understood to be different. So what we have here is, I think, quite a plausible concordance, again, based on the assumptions that I'm making, which is that all of the gospel accounts of these appearances are accurate presentations of eyewitness testimony at a distance of about 10 years or more. I think it's quite a plausible reconstruction. All we have to do here is appeal to known mechanisms of bereavement hallucinations, of expectation, and social processes of memory distortions and contamination and inaccurate eyewitness testimony. All of those aspects that I've mentioned and documented previously, we can, I think, very readily account for how we get these experiences. Just to recap, we have the removal of the body, which leads to the finding of the empty tomb. A bit of memory distortion about exactly how many women were there, but that's not a big deal. We then have one or more of the women having a bereavement hallucination of an angel or multiple angels, depending on which gospel you look at there. That was triggered by seeing the empty tomb, the emotions, the bereavement context. That's quite plausible. We know then that the women tell Peter, who then comes, sees the empty tomb, and himself has a bereavement hallucination of Jesus, triggered by seeing the empty tomb, plus the women's account of seeing an angel, and again, the context of the religious context and the cognitive dissonance and all the other things that I mentioned. That may have happened on that day or possibly like a day later. It's a little unclear. We then have, in the order of events, the next thing I think happened was then the appearances of Jesus to the group of disciples in Jerusalem. Maybe happened once, maybe a series of events in close succession. This, I think, can be understood as an ecstatic collective experiences, triggered by the fact that the tomb was empty, that the women had seen angels, that Peter reported seeing Jesus. Now there's a high expectation. They're emotionally charged. They've got the cognitive dissonance operating. They've probably been fasting and praying. Well, they almost certainly have, reading the scriptures. They're really trying to make sense of this. They're exhausted. They've worked themselves up. They're probably singing and chanting and talking with each other. Do you feel the Spirit? Do you feel Jesus here? There's that self-reinforcing attentional processes, the discursive discussion with each other that brings about the experience in real time. It begins with feelings, then extends to seeing or maybe hearing first and then seeing, and can include seeing the holes in Jesus' hands and other things like that. Later on, through processes of memory distortion, contamination, the accounts become even more impressive. The aspect of eating could easily be incorporated by someone remembering, hey, either even at the time or later on, hey, wasn't there more food on this plate before? And then someone says, oh, Jesus must have eaten. And then that becomes contaminated to, I saw Jesus eat. Very easy to account for this. This is all within the realm of what's documented with memory distortions. Thomas came to understand his experience as initially skeptical and later believing, whether he was initially not present perhaps and didn't believe and then caught up in the excitement later on, or maybe he just sort of thought of himself as more skeptical and that's how he told his story using that narrative device. We don't have to assume that he was a real dyed-in-the-wool skeptic, just that that's how he came to see his experience. Then there was another similar experience on a mountain in Galilee. If you believe Matthew, I think that one's more tenuous. But again, once you'd had that experience in Jerusalem, if you think that they went to Galilee and went up to a mountain to be closer to God, they had a similar experience up there. And then finally, at some point they're in Jerusalem. Maybe there's been other collective experiences as well. But at some point, weeks later, they're in Jerusalem and they have this experience where they're looking up at the sky, pondering something perhaps, or triggered by an initial report of something strange in the sky. The disciples hallucinate and or develop an experience off each other using the attentional processes and reinforcing social contagion that I discussed previously, that they've seen Jesus in the sky in some way through memory distortion. That's later developed into an account of him ascending into the sky, which is then interpreted through that theological context of needing to close out the revelation as him leaving this earth and returning to heaven and thereby ending the resurrection experiences. The then other accounts we have are all subsequent retroactive thinking about, oh, hey, you know the way we felt talking to that guy on the road to Emmaus, or hey, the way we felt when we were fishing and that weird thing happened, and likewise with Mary. Those were then interpreted as Jesus being there, but because it didn't quite fit with the initial memories, it was sort of tacked on and it involved Jesus just sort of being there. And that's why you have this non-recognition motif. Now, I'm not saying that's definitely how the non-recognition motif came to be, but but we could explain these experiences in other ways as well. I just think that that's the most plausible given the assumptions that I'm making here. So what we have here is a naturalistic account not just of general experiences, but of all of the specific details in the Gospels as a combination of sociological, psychological, and memory artifacts. We don't need to postulate any miracles to have a plausible mechanism for what happened. Let's go through and quickly summarize. I think I've already done this, but the RHBS model, in the form that I've presented it, begins with the death of Jesus, which leads to the disciples being in a state of fear and despair. Reburial or possibly theft of the body results in the empty tomb. Cognitive dissonance combining with observing the empty tomb and that feeling of fear and despair then leads to an expectancy. They're not necessarily expecting a resurrection, but they're expecting to see Jesus in some way. I mean, his body is gone. We've got to make sense of how he died and why that makes sense, and we're trying to understand how that matters. This expectancy, in combination with those other factors, led to individual hallucinations of Mary and Peter that I talked about. This then expectancy, in combination with the spiritual context, selective attention, suggestibility, and those cognitive dissonance, all combined to lead to a felt presence of Jesus initially, which then plausibly led to a heard voice, then seeing an angel, then maybe seeing the risen Jesus. I mean, maybe it's directly to seeing the risen Jesus. This is a plausible reconstruction. The exact order is, of course, impossible to know, but this in combination is what generates the collective ecstatic experience of the risen Jesus, particularly in that instance in Jerusalem, maybe later on the mountain in Galilee as well. Then, subsequent to that, you have the accounts being modified through memory conformity, irrational belief persistence, and socialization processes to lead to consolidated account of those memories of having experienced Jesus together. Now, those memories of having experienced Jesus in that group context, as well as the individual context, combined with the empty tomb, led to the belief in the resurrection. And of course, they're also studying the scriptures. They're trying to make sense theologically of what's happened. There's a cognitive dissonance angle. This is what explains the belief in the resurrection, all of those things put together. So this is the RHBS model. This is how we account for all of the key facts about the empty tomb, experiences of the risen Jesus, and the belief in the resurrection. Now, let's compare the two hypotheses that we have considered today, the resurrection hypothesis, and compare that against the RHBS model and evaluate their explanatory scope and plausibility. So, sorry for showing you the whole table at once. I couldn't figure out how to progressively reveal it and was too lazy to implement that manually. So let's just go through one element at a time. First of all, Jesus was one of hundreds, if not thousands, of religious figures who appeared in the middle of history rather than at the beginning and did not become widely known until very recently. I think the resurrection very poorly explains this. The idea that God was not very effective at revealing himself and just left people to their own devices for thousands of years. I mean, the Old Testament talks about him revealing himself to the Jewish people, right? But, subsequent to the flood, if you believe in that, it doesn't seem like God's made much of an effort to reveal himself, and certainly not through this very special revelation, which was Jesus. Why not put that at the start of history so that more people can benefit from that? And in particular, why not have a broader revelation so that more people know about it? Now, the RHBS model, I think, readily explains this. Cognitive processes, although they're conditional on the social context, broadly they're similar throughout history, and so it can account for these processes occurring at any time, really. So I think that that's much better accounted for under the RHBS model as to why it is that Jesus is one of many figures and why he occurs in the middle of history. Well, there's many figures because these processes operate throughout history, and they have been happening and continue to happen. So I think that is a much better fit under the RHBS than the resurrection way, where you have to explain why Jesus is special and then also somehow account for all the other cases in a way that doesn't explain away the resurrection in the way that I talked about before. There's this dilemma. Next aspect is the fact that Jesus is a poor fit with Jewish beliefs about the Messiah. We talked about this, the idea of him not fulfilling all the Messianic prophecies, and also the fact that the Messiah wasn't supposed to die and be resurrected. That just didn't fit with previous Jewish beliefs, as N.T. Wright and Craig have said. So I don't think the resurrection really has a clear reason for this other than, well, God just decided to do it that way, and it wasn't what they expected. God just seems to be a really poor communicator. Like, why wouldn't he make it clearer? Why wouldn't it be more obvious that this is the fulfillment of his prophecies? I think that the explanations that are typically given in terms of God wanting to make the last first and the first last and things like that is just post hoc rationalization. It doesn't really make sense to do it that way. You can reveal those important theological truths in clearer ways that result in more people being brought to a knowledge of Jesus and being brought into a relationship with him. Why do it in this weird way that doesn't make sense and leaves a lot of people confused and a lot of the Jewish nation not believing in the Messiah because rightly so he doesn't fit with what they'd expected? The RHBS model readily explains this because it's on account of being religious adaptation and cognitive dissonance. The early Jewish movement needed to fit Jesus being the Jewish Messiah with what happened to him, so they changed the beliefs, altered them in ways that made it make sense. This is what we see with resolving cognitive dissonance in many other religious movements as well, and outside of that. And so the RHBS model readily explains this. It's exactly what you'd expect, that there would be a combination of existing beliefs, but morphed and changed in a way that was convenient for that new religious context. Next, we move on to the empty tomb. So this is, I think, the only thing that is well explained by the resurrection hypothesis. If you interpret that as a bodily resurrection, well, the body's not going to be in the tomb anymore if Jesus gets up and starts walking around. So I think that actually does work under the resurrection hypothesis. The RHBS model, I think, plausibly explains this because of the reburial or theft of the body. As I discussed, I think both of those things are plausible in the context in which they occurred. Now, the next aspect, Jesus appeared to his followers, but not to anyone else. I think this is very poorly explained by the resurrection hypothesis. So whilst it may be the case that we'd expect Jesus to appear to his followers, you would not expect him to only appear to his followers. It doesn't serve his divine purpose of vindicating his special mission to humanity and his teachings very well. If he only appears to people who already knew him and not to anyone else, why not appear to people all over the world? That would have been much better vindication. And the other thing is, why did he leave? Why didn't he stick around or at least periodically return as further vindication to future generations? It seems like that would have much better served God's purpose of bringing humanity to knowledge of Jesus' special mission and teachings and bringing them into a relationship with him. It seems God is just really bad at achieving his objectives. Like, how are the Chinese people and Indian people and Native Americans supposed to come to a relationship with Jesus when they didn't know about him for thousands of years? And where the evidence just really isn't that good for contemporary observers. Why not have it be stronger evidence so that more people can be convinced? It just doesn't make very much sense. And I think that in order to explain this away, you have to introduce really ad hoc postulates about why God has these strange ways of going about things. The RHBS model, I think, very plausibly explains this. The appearances to his followers through the mechanisms I discussed: hallucinations, expectancy, selective attention, socialization processes. And in particular, it easily explains why he only appeared to his followers, because these the expectancy and socialization processes would only be operative within his followers and not within other people. Obviously, those processes wouldn't be relevant to the Roman Senate or the Chinese imperial court, or just your random Jew who's not a Jewish supporter. So you wouldn't expect to see them having appearances of Jesus. And in fact, you don't see them having appearances of Jesus. So that's exactly what the RHBS expects, that any appearances that do occur would be localized to people who already knew Jesus and were at the very least sympathetic to him, if not outright followers. I haven't mentioned at this point that some people will point to the conversion of Paul as a counterexample here, which it's true, you would not expect under the RHBS model Paul to have an experience of Jesus. I deliberately haven't mentioned this here because Paul did not experience a resurrection appearance of Jesus. That occurred after the ascension. Paul did not know Jesus during his lifetime, and Paul clearly, his followers did not see Jesus appear to them, and possibly didn't even hear the voice. That depends on which account you read. So the appearance to Paul is not at all predicted by the resurrection hypothesis. Why would Jesus appear to his followers, ascend to heaven, and then appear to this random persecutor? There's no explanation for that under the resurrection. And it's really a different phenomenon. It's not to do with the resurrection. It's a later appearance. So I don't try to explain that with the RHBS model either. And I'm not going to try to incorporate that into the explanation until the apologists have an explanation for it within their framework, which they don't. So I don't think that acts as a counterexample to the RHBS model. Now, let's move to specific details of the gospel accounts. Now, I think that these are very poorly explained, particularly that there's absolutely no logic to the appearances. Why does... so Jesus appears, say, to Peter first, maybe because that's because he's like the rock, who'll be the most important or whatever, and he appears to a group of 5 disciples. Okay, that kind of makes sense. But then what's with the non-recognition motif? Why is it that he appears to 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus who don't know he's there until just the very end, and then he disappears? That doesn't make any sense. Why is it that Jesus can appear and disappear in some accounts, but in other accounts he's flesh and body and eats and you can touch him? That doesn't make sense. Why is it that we have these inconsistencies about whether the disciples are in Jerusalem or going to Galilee? And you can try to kind of account for these, but it just seems more likely that these appearances are the result of a combination of events, some of which were brought about through collective ecstatic experiences, and some of which were brought about by memory contamination, and those are the ones that have the non-recognition motif. So I think that the fact that there's no clear logic or ordering to the appearances and the non-recognition motif is really bizarre is much better explained by the RHBS model, that these are social and cognitively constructed appearances and not a very coherent part of a divine plan to maximally achieve God's purposes in revealing himself and vindicating himself to mankind. I don't see how you can get that out of the kind of jumble that we have in the gospel appearances. And finally, the belief in the resurrection, the belief that the disciples that Jesus had been resurrected. So I think this is plausibly enough explained by both of the accounts, right? Both of the accounts say that the disciples came to believe that Jesus had been resurrected because they saw that the tomb was empty, because they saw or believed that Jesus appeared to them, and they studied the scriptures, they thought about it, they tried to make sense of it, and they came to an understanding of it being a resurrection. The only difference is that I think the tomb was empty for a different reason, and that the appearances happened for different reasons. But the actual logic of the belief is pretty much the same in both cases. Now, a counter that's sometimes made is that only a real appearance could have convinced the disciples that Jesus had been resurrected. But I think that there's just no basis for this. All that you need is a sufficiently convincing experience for the disciples to come to a belief that Jesus had appeared to them. And I think I've explained very clearly how that could have been the case. So I don't see the basis of demanding that it just must have been a real experience. Otherwise, the disciples couldn't possibly be convinced of a resurrection, even though a resurrection is exactly the thing that they need to resolve cognitive dissonance. It's like they're primed exactly to believe this, given the context. I don't think it's actually that hard. The experiences that they had were all that they needed to push them to that belief. By the way, we don't actually know that all of Jesus' followers were convinced of the resurrection. Presumably the disciples were, but there may have been some who weren't convinced. As far as we know, that may have been the case. So we can't actually say that every single one of Jesus' followers was convinced of the resurrection. We don't know that, but that's a side point. So when we consider all of these factors, I think that we have to conclude that on some of the points, such as the tomb being empty and the belief in the resurrection, the hypotheses are equivalent, and that's sort of by design. But when you consider other key details, such as the fact that Jesus appeared to his followers and nobody else, the specific details of the gospel accounts, the lack of clear logic to the appearances, the non-recognition motifs, as well as the prior plausibility aspects of Jesus specifically out of all of the figures, and the fact that he doesn't fit with the Messiah beliefs about the Jewish Messiah, I conclude that even making all the assumptions that I have at the outset, that God exists, that he wants to send a special messenger to humans, and that the Gospels accurately report eyewitness testimony, even with all those assumptions, I think we should still conclude that the RHBS model, as I've outlined it here, is a much better explanation of the relevant facts. The resurrection hypothesis is much more ad hoc and doesn't explain all of the relevant aspects. So let's conclude. I think the resurrection is only a good explanation if you already assume that God wants to send a special messenger, not just that, but also that Jesus is very special and a particularly likely candidate to be that messenger. Christians, of course, will think that, and so will just naturally brush off any questions about, well, how do you know that he was a particularly good candidate? What about all of the others? What about missing moral teachings and all this? They just won't find that convincing because they have already convinced themselves that Jesus is a special candidate. They'll compare everyone else to him as the archetype. And I think you essentially need that assumption, that theological assumption, to get you to the resurrection being a good explanation. But in addition to that, you need to assume that God has good reasons for not revealing himself sooner in history, not revealing himself to more people, or not communicating more clearly about the nature of the Messiah, because this relates to the points that I talked about before. Why God didn't reveal himself earlier in history? Why didn't he appear to more people than just his disciples? Why not appeal to the Chinese and the Romans? And why didn't he make more clear prophecies in the Old Testament about the Messiah? Christians will say that the Old Testament does clearly communicate about the Messiah, but it just was misunderstood. But then if it was so readily misunderstood by like almost all of the Jews for all of time, why couldn't God have been a bit clearer? You have to make ad hoc assumptions about why that was the case. If it was misunderstood, why did God allow himself to be misunderstood? In addition, you need to assume that the Gospels reliably report key details like the empty tomb and the post-mortem appearances, and I have assumed that for the time being, but that is a necessary assumption. Also, you need to find a way to explain miracle claims from other traditions that involve miracles and paranormal events in group occurrences without appealing to the same processes that could also account for the resurrection. This is the dilemma I talked about before. It needs to be the case that you can say why these other miracle claims occur, but you can't then appeal to all the same naturalistic processes unless you can explain why that wouldn't also explain the resurrection in a non-naturalistic way. So I think that there's an extra dilemma here. Now, the RHBS model does not require any of these assumptions. The only thing that we need to do is apply established background knowledge from psychology, history, and sociology to the specific cases of Jesus. So yes, I need to assume that the body was removed. I don't think that's so implausible given the context. It's an assumption. I need to assume that, say, Peter and Mary had bereavement hallucinations. That's an assumption, but I think it's quite plausible. We need to assume that the disciples had, triggered by those appearances and the context, ecstatic collective experiences of the risen Jesus. I think that's plausible given the context and given what we know from psychology and from other cases, but it is an assumption. So what I need to assume effectively amounts to applying known processes and known mechanisms to a specific case. And yes, that does come with, some costs because I don't know definitively what happened. There's a postulates that I'm making there. But what I'm arguing is that I don't need to make as many assumptions, and the assumptions that I make are much more plausible. I don't need to make all these assumptions about the nature of God and all of these strange intentions that he has about how he wants to do things. Relating to sending Jesus and resurrecting Jesus and communicating in the Old Testament, and then why Jesus only appeared to certain people and why their appearance claims are like a bit strange and these non-recognition motifs. There's all these strange things that I just don't need to assume at all. I just don't need to assume that God has unspecified reasons for this. And so as a result, I think that the RHBS model is a better explanation for the relevant facts than the resurrection hypothesis, even when assuming, and let's go back to the very beginning, this is even when making these strong assumptions 1 through 4, that a creator God exists, that God does have a reason to send a special messenger, that Jesus was a moral prophet and teacher, and he was executed and buried. And assuming that facts 5, 6, and 7 also pertain. Those are the facts that I explain. 1 through 4 are the baseline assumptions that I use, in addition to the psychological and sociological findings. So even when making very strong assumptions, and I think all of these points, except for 3 and 4, can be reasonably contested, there is still a more plausible naturalistic explanation than the resurrection hypothesis. So I hope you found this interesting. Thanks very much for listening. If you're interested in getting in touch with me, you can send me an email, fods12@gmail.com, fods12@gmail.com. I'm very happy to have guests on who have different opinions. As long as you have something thoughtful and substantive to say, get in touch and feel free to disagree with me or chat about this in another context. If you'd like to learn more about my hypothesis and some of the evidence I cite in favor of it, check out my book, Unreasonable Faith, How William Lane Craig Overstates the Case for Christianity. You can get it on Amazon or other book shops of your choice. Thanks very much for listening. Take care.